This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Hang on. Welcome to today's meeting of Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. On our agenda today is a discussion on the progress made by the London Fire Brigade in responding to the findings and recommendations of the Independent Culture Review 1 year on. Before we begin, we have a few small items of business. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on X, formerly known as Twitter, and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. And can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? No, Chair. Can we note the completed actions and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings of this committee? No, we now move on to our main item, the Independent Culture Review of the London Fire Brigade 1 year on. Can I welcome our guests? We have Baroness Twycross, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, Andy Rowe, London Fire Commissioner, Martin Forde KC, who will be joining us in a few minutes, and Ben Selby, Assistant General, Fire Brigades Union. I'd like to note that the committee has received an email from the mother of Jaden Francois Esprit and will write further to the Commissioner to follow up on the contents of that email. I will start with the questions and I'll hand on to my fellow Assembly members. My first question, Andy. We sat in this room a year ago after the Culture Review had been published. 1 year on, what have your key achievements been over the last 12 months addressing the findings of the Independent Culture Review?
Thank you, Chair. So a year is a short time, but I think we've made a lot of progress. And I'd like to lay out some of the achievements that I think the men and women of the London Fire Brigade deserve credit for. What I would say before I talk in the specifics of that is I want to caveat everything I say today with the context that I don't believe you ever finish addressing your culture. It's not a start and finish process. I think if you are one of the great institutions of this country, as I see us, you have a duty to constantly review, acknowledge failings and seek to improve. So this is not an attempt to suggest we have done everything we need to, nor that we will ever finish that task, because that is a responsibility I believe all leaders in my organisation have to accept and work towards. So I think probably the most disturbing aspects of the review were the examples of terrible behaviours that I know no decent London firefighter could either accept or view as anything other than abhorrent. So I think the most important thing we've done actually is to ensure that staff have somewhere to call if they have experienced that. So we launched an independent complaint service for staff to report concerns and complaints. Well over 320 contacts since that went live in December last year, in comparison to 22 in the year before, into a different internal whistleblowing scheme. From those 300 plus contacts, 84 investigations undertaken, numerous discipline processes enacted, 13 people so far exited from the organisation, multiple sanctions at other levels from demotion to final written warning, with many hearings still to play out over the rest of this year. So I think probably the most important thing we've done is to set a very basic standard and demand compliance. Doesn't mean it hasn't been challenging, because actually that volume of complaint is difficult to deal with, but we are very focused on working our way through that and ensuring that those people that do not meet the standard, do not come to work correct, are identified and dealt with fairly but appropriately. We have delivered the largest leadership programme face-to-face in LFB's history. Again, that is not start and finish, it is a continual process. So that's 1,600 leaders through the Leadership Academy courses, 1,700 leaders with some overlap through the Leading Culture conversations, specific workshops for our colleagues who lead and are part of equality support groups, the staff network, and inclusive leadership training for our 130 most senior leaders. Either a commissioner or a director or an AC has visited all 102 fire stations to discuss culture, and we are now entering another very intensive round of visits between now and March to come back, revisit where we've got to in direct conversation with staff and talk about our values. I visited 91 fire stations last year, multiple teams, departments, mass events, and I have a good gauge of the way the conversation is going, both in success and in challenge. We appointed a programme director to run what is a very significant programme of change with a team to support them, and we have a clear programme of works, 5 major projects with multiple work streams beneath each heading, addressing everything from a reformation of our HR processes and teams to the way we train, the way we educate, and the way we hold people to account. We have had very significant investment from the Mayor and the Greater London Authority to achieve that, whether it was £1.4 million to set up, maintain an external reporting line with all the investigation process that falls from it, whether it was the £10 million for the Privacy for All programme, bolstered by another £1 million, improved maternity provision, because frankly that wasn't fit for purpose when we looked at it, to the tune of £2.8 million, nearly £250,000 on vetting, and I applaud the support of colleagues like Susan and the Minister, who ensured that we saw a change in legislation that enables us now to deliver enhanced disclosure to all our staff, and that process has begun, and nearly £1 million on leadership training. We conducted an independent review of our people services. One of the most depressing aspects of the culture review was that our HR services were not fit for purpose. I think it is as bluntly stated as that in the report. We are in the middle of a fundamental reshaping of that, and we will be the first service in the country to set up a large professional standards unit, which will bring all of the misconduct handling and proactive assessment of our professional standards into one place, led by people who have good experience in that space in other organisations, and our own staff, both uniformed and non-uniformed, who've gone through a very, what I would call, significant integrity filter to ensure they set the standard that others follow. We've started to use our data in a different way to take very focused action in those places where we still face real challenge, because I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've somehow fixed, in inverted commas, the culture of the London Fire Brigade, because, as I said at the start, I don't believe that is real, nor accurate, nor respectful to say to this committee. But we are certainly focusing in on those areas where we know we still have challenge, down to team level, and we can demonstrate we are taking action. Again, that process will never end in an organisation the size of the London Fire Brigade that faces the trauma and the operational challenge on a daily basis. It does. I hope that gives you a sense of some of the headlines of what we've done in what has been a very busy year. And what I would like to say, you know, having sat here a year ago and expressed my utter disappointment and horror, really, at what the report showed us, is I do need to give credit to the very many decent, hard-working and professional firefighters and officers that have engaged with this, that have had to look into our organisation, as disappointed as I was, but with the same courage that they step out onto the incident ground with, have faced inwards to try and grapple with this. And they do deserve some credit, because it has been a very difficult year. They have had to face up to difficult truths about their own organisation, and I think they have done so with some dignity. And I would like to give them credit, because it is the good that has to lead the others who have not yet met that standard. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. There was 23 recommendations made a year ago. How many have been fully implemented?
So if I come to the recommendations, we have completed 9, but again, I don't really like the word complete. We have completed the initial actions to deliver, but they need to be under review, and they will be iteratively improved, because that's part of continuous improvement. 14 are well underway. So in terms of headlines figures, 9 completed, but needing to be maintained, 14 in progress. And obviously I have updates against each of them should the Chair seek to question on any of those individual recommendations.
I think we'll be coming to that, but I just for me, what's proving the most challenging?
What's proving the most challenging? I don't think I could pick one, because I think there's challenge in every area, whether it's persuading colleagues that we must make this our focus because it underpins actually our ability to deliver safe operations into London, whether it's breaking through actually what are at times very unhelpful and polarised external narratives around culture that don't actually speak to the reality but speak to extremes rather than the nuance and kind of challenge of actually moving things positively forward. I think it's the scale of misconduct allegation we're dealing with. That's real. And actually some of the delays in kind of addressing such a huge case number, because that does have an impact on people, both people who are respondents and those who've complained. So I think that gives you some idea. It's that hearts and minds. It's the education and explanation in the context of an extremity of external debate, and making sure we keep people safe in the volume of what is, you know, it's a real kind of drawing of a line around misconduct and the energy that's required in that.
Okay, thank you for that. Fiona, I'm going to come to you. What's your view of the progress that has been made so far?
Thank you, Chair. So I think going back to your comments at the beginning, I think it is important for us to remember that the trigger for this work wasn't the report by the HMIC FRS. It was actually a young man's death. And I think nothing less than success and long-term change is acceptable in that context in relation to culture change. So on your point around sort of specific recommendations, how many have been completed, I think it's also important to recognise that the LFB's gone beyond the recommendations of the Culture Review and has sought to embed culture change within all of its work streams as part of the wider transformation work. and a lot of that work is obviously set out in the Community Risk Management Plan. So I think that the LFB over the past year has made considerable progress, but a large part of that progress is in getting the building blocks right for the future. So a huge amount of staff engagement and incorporating and responding to feedback in the ongoing development plan. And also obviously refining its plans in discussions with the inspectorate. So I think some of these basics should never have been wrong, and we had that conversation at the last meeting of this committee. So a functioning HR service, every single organisation needs a functioning HR service. The right facilities in fire stations. How could we had a situation where we didn't have the right facilities for people? That's a basic respect at work piece. A uniform that is fit for purpose, and training and development that meets the requirements of a professional 21st century fire service. Maternity pay that actually reflects the job that women are doing and that they're coming back to. So all these things should have been right to start with. I think that staff don't necessarily recognise these as culture change, but I think the respect that underlines getting those basics right in relation to how the organisation treats its staff are really essential parts of actually having a respectful culture from the leadership through the various parts of the organisation. Behaviours need to change. I think we'll probably get onto that later when the committee talks about grievances. But there is still a lot of work to be done around behaviours, the new values for the organisation, or renewed values for the organisation, that have been launched internally early this week will also form part of the foundations and probably be more easily understood by staff as part of the culture change. But I think it's process that is essential. And for me, the big thing that will make sure that the commitment that's been made by the Commissioner and the senior team, and the commitment that the Mayor is fully behind as well, including, as the Commissioner said, through funding for the service. I think it's the professional standards unit that will really drive through change. You have to have a culture where poor behaviours are dealt with, that people see they're dealt with effectively and fairly, and that actually people know that if they raise a complaint, it is dealt with. And too often in the past, when people raise concerns or raise complaints, they weren't dealt with in an appropriate way or in a fair way. And I think it's making sure that all the policies underpinning behaviours and culture are both fit for purpose, but they're also understood and abided by everyone in the process, and that those people responsible for driving these policies through have a good understanding of what the policy is, but also understand and believe in the values that underpin the respect that every single member of staff should be able to feel entitled to in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ben, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's your view of the progress so far by the LFB?
Hi, thanks, Chair. Look, I think, first of all, I think there's no doubt now the issue of culture and behaviours within London Fire Brigade, but broadly across the UK Fire and Rescue Service, is now being taken far more seriously post the London Cultural Review report. It's been a dominating issue right across the sector. You know, no doubt you'll be well aware of the reports that have been conducted in other fire and rescue services by the inspectorate, but also by organisations like the NFCC. And I think it's one thing I would say at an early juncture is, one thing that is crucially important right now is that all elements of the sector, including the Fire Brigade Union, start to work collectively to challenge and improve the culture and behaviours across the UK Fire and Rescue Service. In terms of our take more directly on the recommendations, broadly we supported the recommendations in the culture review. There were elements that we thought would bring some challenges in terms of implementation, but again, I praise our local officials in London, specifically Gareth Cook and the equality leads in London, as part of the Fire Brigade Union, for working so closely and positively with senior management to bring about some of that change. I think it is a positive that there is a serious take by the Commissioner to try and improve a service that's fit for women to join, and one of those key elements is about improving the maternity provision. I don't think it's gone far enough yet, but I think it's hugely improved, and I think that should be commended. And again, I commend the Women's Action Committee in London for fighting for that and working alongside the Commissioner to bring about that change, which is positive. But I think the clock wind back a little bit further than just last year. There was a significant review of the UK Fire and Rescue Service in 1999, the thematic review, that looked at many areas around equality, and it reported that, as you are aware, and sadly hasn't greatly improved, that there was very few women in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. That hasn't overly improved since 1999, and I think that's important that we look at the reasons for that. And again, I'd make the point, some of the actions that have happened in recent months and years will do something to improve that, but I think it will take far more than just looking at the maternity provision. I think we need to look into more detail around that. Look, it was a catalyst for a large debate at the Fire Brigade Union conference last year, where we moved towards having a campaign specifically around equality, the Equality Matters campaign. I think it's important for us to recognise our responsibility, representing most people within the Fire and Rescue Service, certainly over 95% within the London Fire Brigade, and we need to understand we've got a role in challenging behaviours equally, and that campaign really is looking directly at the behaviours of our members. We've still got a way to go. I think I don't think progress is easy to measure when we're talking of culture. I think it will be much easier to look back in 20 years' time and see what was the impact of this, how did things change. But in terms of adapting the culture within the Fire and Rescue Service, I believe positive forward steps are being made, certainly in the London Fire Brigade. It's pleasing to see underrepresented groups being consulted with and being part of the discussion about developing their fire and rescue service. And again, that should be commended. But there is no doubt the sector's in a place where it can't sit back now. It's got to act, and broadly we've got to come together. And I think that will be a constant message from me today, that we're keen to work with other stakeholders across the fire and rescue service in delivering a significant change for generations to come too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And coming on to that, Andy, what assurances can you give to women and Londoners of all backgrounds wanting to join the brigade that they can have a good and successful career in the brigade should they join today?
So number one, I still think being a London firefighter is the best job in the world. I've had an extraordinary career full of extraordinary experiences with such close friends, colleagues, and I want everyone to have equal access to that. We have by no means finished the job we've started, but you are joining the London Fire Brigade at a point where not only are we very focused on this, so we're thinking about the environment you step into, how we support you, how we empower you to be part of that change, but actually credit to colleagues in the Fire Brigades Union, to the Inspectorate, to my colleagues on the GLA, to those in government, we're not marking our own homework. You know, we are probably the most scrutinised fire and rescue service in the country, and that is a good thing, because marking your own homework didn't get us very far in the past. So what I would say to anyone joining is you are not joining into a service that is complacent. It knows there are still issues, but there are a great many decent men and women, rank and file firefighters and officers in the London Fire Brigade, who now they have got over the shock of what they heard in that report, are engaged in ensuring that we don't see another one in 5 years' time, that we don't fail this time. And I would welcome, you joining our organisation to be part of that change, because I think this is a magnificent occupation. No disrespect to other colleagues around the country, Ben, in the best place in the world to be a firefighter. So that would be my pitch. Not without its challenges, but it's still an amazing place to work in an amazing city.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We spoke at the last meeting quite a bit about staff surveys and how they were being used. Before I hand over to colleagues, I want to ask you a bit about the staff surveys. What have they told you about the extent in which staff feel that progress on cultural issues have been made in the past year?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that as an exercise on its own, it was successful, just in terms of the engagement, so staff actually speaking to us. I know that's quite a low baseline in some ways, but the London Fire Brigade had never got beyond sort of a high 40% of people responding to a staff survey, even with some very vigorous encouragement in an era which was less contended, actually, whereas this staff survey had a 70% response rate. So it's been very, very useful. It's told us all sorts of things. It's quite a sophisticated tool. We can dissect it down to team level. So I know whether or not individual teams have either engaged, not engaged, you know, how they felt specifically. So it's not just the big, broad brush analysis that's useful. It's the 8,000 free text comments where we've used an algorithm to interrogate it and look at keywords. It's told us an enormous amount about the organisation. And what it's told us is that, like all big organisations, there is a real mix of feelings. Some positivity in some areas, some staff groups who feel more positive and others who don't. You know, for example, I know we've got more we need to do for our black colleagues. It was clear from the staff survey that they still don't feel supported, that they still feel isolated at times, and we need to grapple with that and face that head on. We can see that other staff groups, actually women for example, are beginning to feel better supported. Bullying had dropped by a 6% response rate since the 2018 survey, despite obviously the very depressing outcomes of the culture review. That doesn't mean that I think that we haven't got a really serious issue to deal with. It's more the fact that we're able to break it down in multiple different ways and try and understand it. What I would say is that we're using it as a tool. It's not just something to look at and marvel at. It's about taking it out into those individual teams, sitting down with them and saying, you know, you said this to us, what can we do to help improve your working life? Or actually, where we see vulnerabilities linked to other HR data, holding people to account for poor behaviour, because that staff survey is also a good indicator of where people perhaps aren't on board with this, and we might need to go and ask some more searching questions. You know, say, for example, you're on a station where there's high transfer rates, high sickness, you know, a black colleague or women have historically not been supported there, because you can see that in the transfer data. So we're using that survey in all sorts of different ways. And, you know, again, I'll be happy to write with a summary of what we found from that survey, because it is detailed and multifaceted.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just welcome this school in the just a welcome to the Year 10s at the London Enterprise Academy, who are now joining us in the public gallery. And finally, from me, when will you be introducing the pulse surveys?
So the pulse survey is looking to go out. We're deciding on the exact times. There's a bit of survey fatigue. So we haven't actually stopped surveying. So, for example, we've just carried out a very large-scale survey related to culture around health and safety culture, because actually it's a part of the point that the Deputy Mayor spoke to, is if you don't sort your uniform, if people don't feel safe, their places of work are frankly a bit derelict, you're struggling to explain how they hold themselves to a standard. So we've just done that. That will tell us something about our culture. I'll be happy to bring the results of that when we've got it into future committees. Yep. We've got the HMIC FRS national survey on misconduct, which is happening now. They've just extended the deadline to December the 15th. So I need to time the next survey to ensure that I get the same sort of response rate, because otherwise it's a tick box exercise. So I think we were planning for February. We might give it another month to give people a break from it, so we go back and engage again and get a proper gauge of where we're at. By then as well, you'll have had the professional standards unit up and running. We'll have done an enormous amount of communication across every part of the organisation around values. It'll probably be a good point to go back and get a sense of whether that's had an impact, whether it's worked in the way we wanted to. So I think we're looking at some time beyond March.
Yeah, March. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Bakari now.
Thank you so much, Chair. I've listened really carefully to your words, Andy, and I think you're right in saying that it's been an incredibly tough and traumatic experience. I mean, look, when we were looking through the report, but also since then we've spoken to people within the LFB, I'm disappointed that Nazir Afzal isn't here today, because one of the things that he said was incredibly striking, is the fact that it affected his mental health, dealing with the responses that he got. And to be honest, I've heard some things that have been absolutely horrific and unbelievable and absolutely shocking. So I make no apologies to this. I think we are going to be pretty tough on you today, because we have to be, because of what we learned from that, and the fact that a year on, we want to see, I know it's going to be a continual change, I know this is not going to end, but we do need to see change. And we received a letter, I think all the Assembly members did, and it said that this is a watershed moment for the brigade, and I hope this is a watershed moment, but we do need to see some real clear evidence of that watershed moment very, very soon. And despite the fact that we can't see too much change in a year, but we do need to see some. And the last meeting that we discussed about the fact there were no dismissals as a result of the changes since the culture review. That is disappointing, and I do realise that there are some issues that you can't go into detail because of.
Can I just respond to that? I'm afraid that's incorrect. I don't believe that's what we did say. And just to be absolutely clear, there is not 0 dismissals. We've had legal advice that meant we had to breach a threshold so individuals couldn't be identified. We're actually standing at 13. I expect, speaking frankly, a number to follow that will grow that number. And we've had a very large number of sanctions at lower levels. That includes demotion, that includes final written warning. So I actually think that's not a correct characterisation of where we're at. And apologies if that's what's been communicated, but I'm not aware that we've ever said there's been 0 dismissals. I think that's stuff that's been claimed by external actors incorrectly in outside of the boundaries of the London Fire Brigade. I am very clear, because I have a weekly update on how discipline and misconduct proceedings are moving forward.
I want to talk about that, because in the letter it says it's resulted in there's been staff that have been exited. So my question is this: what do you mean? Because exited, this is a great letter. I can see that a lot of work's gone into it. The words are very carefully written. I don't want to see the LFB being an excellent example of a PR exercise. I want there to be some real change. The culture review demands that. I don't want to see glossiness. I want to see actual positive change. So what I do want to see is an understanding of what you mean by the word exited. Because exited could mean a number of things. And I will bring in the Deputy Mayor in a moment. But exited could mean, thank you very much, off you go, you've been a bit bad, and maybe you can come back later on. It could mean you've done something that's been terrible. You need to think about it, and then if there's a position later on, we might bring you back because we've known you for a long time. So I want to be clear on this.
Assembly Member, I can give you an exact answer in the terms of the numbers. So I'm talking about 30, and I'll give you the breakdown now. 6 of them have been exited with no opportunity to be re-employed, and more importantly, if we get a legislative change, which I hope we do, and it becomes a regulated profession, I hope those people end up on a barred list. So I would hope all 13 end up on a barred list if government can support us for another step in legislation around the regulation of the profession. Of those 13, because people are beginning to understand that if you end up in a misconduct hearing, we will apply natural justice, we will do it fairly, but you stand a very real chance of losing your job. Those 13 are either sacked, that's 6 of them, or 7 resigned with loss of pension, loss of rights before they ever got to that hearing. So that's what exit means. Let there be no confusion. That's not a cover-up. There's not been some fudge. We're not parking them to the side. So I think it's important you've asked the question. It's a good question. Again, I'm sorry if the language doesn't make it clear, but to be frank, that means you've gone, you're not coming back, you didn't meet the standards that were required to be a London firefighter.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member. So I think I was keen to back up what Andy was saying about the number of people who've been exited or who left with a cloud over them, whether that's under their own volition or whether they've been sacked. I think the issue for the Fire Brigade and the fire service generally in relation to not having that capacity to have a barred list is a real one, because rightly people want to know that people who shouldn't be in the service are being fired or are leaving and aren't going to get jobs in the future. And I think that a barred list, which we would hope that the committee would support the National Fire Chiefs Council for pushing for, would have the same effect at the other end as the DBS checks that the committee pushed for did, sort of, for people coming in and for people throughout the service. So I think I am pleased. I'm not pleased there's that many people that we've reached the threshold, because that means that they've been there and there's been an issue. But I am pleased that we've now reached the threshold where the fire brigade is able to say we have sacked people, because that's a really strong message to send back into the organisation, both for people who may be behaving badly, but particularly for those people who feel that they've been subjected to behaviours by the members of staff that they shouldn't have been. And I think I'm glad we've got the opportunity to make it really clear there is no place for these people in the London Fire Brigade. There is no place for these people in the fire service across the UK. And working with other fire and rescue services, with the HMI, with the Home Office, with groups like yourselves, we want to make sure that the fire service has the rigorous discipline, and that if people behave badly, they do not have a place in London Fire Brigade or any other fire and rescue service in the country. Thank you.
Okay, now I understand Assembly Member Bailey would like
to
come in.
So can I just, about this barred list, is this a public barred list? Aren't you a little bit worried about the effect it will have on the individual's future? Because yes, this person may have behaved badly, yes, they are not up to your standard, but mightn't this be that they can not get any employment once they've been dismissed? Is that a risk?
I don't want to sound unsympathetic, but that's not my concern. Because if I look at health and if I look at policing, you can publicise individual outcomes of discipline. It's a massive deterrent to poor behaviour, because you know you're going to be publicly named. And it shouldn't be like that. You're absolutely right. As a committee, we should expect better of people. But I would like us to be in the same place as health professions, some health professions, and policing, where actually, when you come in, you understand the responsibility and the privilege putting this uniform on means. And if you don't uphold those standards and you're dismissed as a result, we publish that. And I'm afraid you do go on a barred list, because I think if you want the privilege of sticking this uniform on and serving London, you have to accept the consequences if you don't meet that standard. So I would really like, it's one of the things that I've asked directly into the Inspectorate and into my colleagues in government, I would really like us to see us become a regulated profession, because I think it, again, would both give firefighters the respect for the kind of responsibility that profession delivers, and it would also act as a reminder that that privilege comes with consequences if you don't meet the standard.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, somebody on Vicari.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the people, the officers who are assigned to the culture review, and about that particular post. Now, I understand that the senior responsible officer is Deputy Commissioner Jonathan Smith, who's appointed to lead the culture change programme. And I'm also interested to know whether there's something similar within the union as well, if we've got a similar role there. So, Andy, if we can start with that particular role and the officer assigned to culture review.
Yeah, so really this speaks to the programme and project approach. So if we wind it outside of culture review, one of the criticisms that you've heard spoken into this committee before as a result of inspection was that we didn't always take a systemic approach to addressing issues, running projects, ensuring we use the Mayor's investment properly. So it's bigger than John, who's the senior responsible owner. So that's about his seniority, and in fact I want the most senior level of accountability in respect to culture to hold an oversight. Sitting at a layer below is Jerry Kirkby, who's in the audience somewhere here, I think, today, who's our programme director. So he sits at the board level, and he's responsible for making sure that the 5 projects with the multiple work streams that sit underneath are delivered properly, on time, on budget, and that we assure ourselves they're beginning to embed. Every single one of those projects has got a project lead and manager, and it is looked at through our normal programme and project reporting, so there's a continuous sort of scrutiny of it. With our assurance team, MOPAC as well, been given the opportunity to go and have a look internally before we're scrutinised externally. So there's layers of kind of management and leadership to deliver what is a massive programme that covers everything from our uniform to our buildings to our education, you know, to our discipline and conduct, to a reformation of HR. It's whole-scale change. In terms of the involvement of the representative bodies, I'm going to give some credit to the FBU nationally and the London region. They've been very supportive. I mean, don't get me wrong, they come with challenge. They should do. You know, I'm a 97% unionised workplace, and they're not there to be my friend. They are another layer of scrutiny and challenge, and they don't always see the world the same way, and sometimes their view is extremely useful. The way we've brought that view in is we have, for example, Gareth Cook, who unfortunately couldn't be here today from the London region. He sits on all the consultative groups and planning groups around culture, so he's embedded into that process. He's got direct sight. The positive improvement team, which is where all our staff network leads, including FBU leads for women, black colleagues, LGBTQ+, are now permanently seconded into the London Fire Brigade to be empowered to deliver some of the change. I mean, they are beginning to experience some of the challenges of delivering change inside a big organisation, so they're experiencing some of those frustrations firsthand. But they're in there, and they're in the space, and I know this committee has met colleagues in that context as well. I can't speak for the structures within the union itself, but what I can tell you is I will not be able to deliver this without the support of my union colleagues across all the representative bodies, because we are a heavily unionised environment and their members are our employees, and they have a strong and powerful voice in the organisation that must both be respected and heard, and I would hope used for the positive benefit of all. So I hope that gives you a sense of the kind of comprehensive approach.
Before I move on to Ben to discuss this further, but I understand that you consult, that you bring in people from different organisations who represent ethnic minorities and women, etc. How many are there from those particular groups who have lived experience, who are actually making decisions, are in the room, on the table, making those very crucial decisions?
I think there's a widespread, because their voice is directly heard into corporate decision making. So there's no filter, for example, between John Smith, who's the SRO, and those leads on that positive improvement team.
And do you think that they are the best qualified people for that
They're
job?
the people who have been selected by their own members democratically to represent them, so I have to honour that. So they're voices amongst many. I suppose what I would say is I don't think this is just about those people. It's about driving change from the shop floor, and that is tricky because firefighters have a history of not being heard. If I think about the years of industrial dispute, and I think the wasted years of looking inwards and the kind of place it took us to, you have to overcome a natural cynicism, and you can only do that actually through a level of mass engagement, and you have to acknowledge when you're not getting things right.
I just want to know whether we truly reflect the diversity that's necessary in those positions. You know, in the most senior operational teams, do we truly reflect the diversity of London?
Not necessarily in the operational teams, but in terms of the people who have a direct voice into the decision making around culture, yes. And we're increasingly diversifying our senior officer cadre as well. But that is difficult. That's a generational issue inside the National Fire Service. I can't invent people, putting it bluntly. So what I've got to do is give real opportunity to younger Londoners and then find a way to give them that opportunity.
And you've not thought about maybe reaching out outside of the LFB to get expertise in to those senior positions? Or is it always going to be within the internal?
So if you think about the director cadre, they're a live example of people who've come from other industry who are demonstratively more diverse than any previous executive cadre we've had. If you then look into the ACs, the level below, you know, again, it's a small cadre of people, but in its proportionality, there is a balance. You know, we have colleagues from the black community, we have women in that space, LGBTQ+ colleagues. So where we can, we bring people in and we seek to diversify with internal talent. But what I won't do is make something up in front of this committee. There is a job to do there because I've got a wealth of talent where we're increasingly diversifying at the more junior end of the organisation. We're bringing in the right people from the outside because it can't be tokenism. These have got to be people that can operate in a tough environment and drive real change, because otherwise I devalue that as well. So it's really trying all the tricks to try and achieve what I think is a fair challenge from yourself, and we're very committed to doing that. But I will not shift that quickly in terms of coming up through the middle and senior cadres and getting really genuine, representative kind of leadership. So it's a work in progress, and if necessary, we bring voices in, even if they haven't got the rank, quite frankly, in a hierarchical organisation, who can give that lived experience and that kind of view into LFB. I mean, for example, Martin sitting next to me, he chairs the advisory panel. We've only had one of those, but we've got survivors from New Cross and Grenfell on our community forum. They will have a voice into the advisory panel. We've got trade union representatives on that panel, colleagues from government, people with lived experience. Wherever we can, we're trying to find a way to bring the voice into decision making if the hierarchy doesn't always represent that diversity of view.
Ben.
Hi, thank you for the question. I think the concern I broadly have around the subject is that when we utilise the term consult, it's often almost sometimes a tick box exercise in how things are being developed. One thing I have seen in the last year in the London Fire Brigade, and I think it should be an example more broadly across the service, is the willingness to allow people from underrepresented groups to be able to design what that looks like and drive forward the change. And I think, again, that should be commended and replicated further afield, and that is broadly positive. In terms of our own organisation, well, what we will say is that for our organisation, for the London Fire Brigade and right across, if we're talking about representation at senior levels, we could all do better, and
So
I think it's really important to recognise
women and ethnic minorities are within your executive?
of an executive of 13, from underrepresented groups, 4. Yeah.
Could do better.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I accept
Okay.
the challenge to do better, yeah. But we do, it's same as what Andy projected from the LFB, we do invite sections to advise the Executive Council and come and contribute to our Executive Council decision making, which I think is crucially important. But equally, our conference is made up of people from many different backgrounds that support the conference debate, bring their lived experiences into that discussion and help us design our policy following conference. The conference sits at the top of the Fire Brigade Union in terms of decision making. It's then the responsibility of the Executive Council to implement the policy set by conference. I hold the role as the Assistant General Secretary. One of my remits is the Equalities Lead for the Fire Brigade Union, and it would be impossible for me to be able to manage that remit without the support of our 3 equality sections that play a huge role in assisting me, advising me, and also designing what they want their fire and rescue service to be right across the broad inclusion and equality debate. We've got a long way to go in the Fire Brigade Union. I think we accept that. I think we've got a long way to go in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. I pointed earlier to a report from 1999, and the truth is, in that time, we've not gone far enough. I don't think we've really caused any significant change in the Fire and Rescue Service. We talk now of it being a watershed moment. I imagine that's been said around this issue many, many times, but if we don't act today, we don't come together today, then we won't see change for generations in the fire service to come. And I think, again, I'm not trying to make the same points over and over again, but this measure of improving culture won't be resolved by 1 or 2 small sticking plasters. We need to seriously look at how we do that, and that requires us to come together and listen to those that are affected by some of the damaging behaviours that we've seen.
I appreciate that, Ben, and you're right. I mean, there have been many occasions when we've had supposed watershed moments. In 1999, there was an equality and fairness in the fire service review as well. So this is not the first time we've heard this. How many staff groups are represented in the positive improvement team, and have you got specific examples of how this has influenced the LFB policy, Commissioner?
Yeah, absolutely. So it covers the full suite of the staff network. So we've got colleagues from the Black, Asian and ethnic minority representative groups, both in the support staff and operational sides, both union and internal staff network. We have LGBTQ+ representatives. Actually, the Irish Society, people sort of forget about the Irish in London, but we've got a huge Irish community inside the London Fire Brigade that themselves have suffered, a long history of discrimination in London and difficult history. And I think sometimes people characterise them as just organising the yearly St Patrick's Day parade. Actually, they absolutely gave me a different version of events when I met them. So they're another example. We have colleagues who represent those who are suffering with really serious mental health issues. The average London firefighter experiences between 400 and 600 profoundly traumatic events in the context of often long careers. That is not without impact. They have a voice in that decision making. We have colleagues who represent their fellow workers who are neurodivergent, and again, as one of the most profoundly, and I don't mean this glibly, dyslexic organisations in the country. If you look at us and the British Army, it's probably the two of us, because we're still one of the last great working class institutions where you can join with no formal qualifications. Perhaps school didn't suit you, but you bring all these other talents and skills with you. Actually, we've got a great need to continue to do better to support those colleagues, because we've not always done right by them. So pretty much the full sweep of protected characteristics, the different demographics. We've got a veteran support group. The job is full of people who are ex-forces, who actually bring some very complex histories with them before they even get to the London Fire Brigade. If I think about my own operational career as a soldier, I was standing on a street in Omagh and in Portadown and saw terrible things before I ever reached the London Fire Brigade. I've got many colleagues who are the same, who bring immense skills, but also the scars of previous careers and need support as well. So I think we've got a very wide representative suite of staff networks. We can always do better to make sure colleagues are connected in, that we genuinely hear their voices. And if you had them in here now, I'm sure they'd tell you that they still have frustrations. There are things we could do better that we don't always hear clearly enough. But all I can tell you is you've got an utter commitment from the senior leadership team of the London Fire Brigade to listen carefully and just relentlessly come back to things, because that's really how change happens in a big organisation. You don't just get it done. My experience is you tend to have to come back and look again and again and drive it forward again.
Thank you. Now, moving on to the people services. Now, that there was in the review, it said, one of the firefighters said, there's no point in asking people services for help. They're in cahoots with the managers. So what progress has been made in responding to the 65 recommendations in the independent review of the people services?
Fundamental progress, but it's been very, very difficult. It's been one of the most challenging aspects of change over the past year. So we accepted pretty much in totality the findings from that independent review. Not everything, because although it was searching, it was conducted over a relatively short period. But the major points within it we accept. The HR department needed to completely reform in terms of its functional structure. That's why we're establishing a professional standards unit. That is your prime example of it, actually, an independent unit that deals directly with misconduct, grievance, investigation, whilst maintaining an independent external reporting and specialist function. She talked about the leadership. Since May 23, we've appointed really experienced and robust interim senior leaders who are driving through the formal process of the reconstruction of our whole HR service. We've just come out of formal consultation for phase 1. A lot of that work is happening now. Phase 2 will start in January, where we start to look at the OD functions, the organisational development functions. We took a phased approach because obviously our primary kind of priority was focusing on misconduct and behaviour and the functions and need to better support that and investigate, because that's where the greatest risk was to individual members of staff. By December, like I said, the professional standards unit will be set up.
Do you have a number of how many recommendations have been fully addressed?
I'd have to write to you that because there's so many, but I'm absolutely happy to give you that detail because they were very wide-ranging. My view is that once we've got through phase 2, I expect us to have dealt with commencement or finish of all of the ones that we categorically agree with. But again, it'll be a process of making sure that was fit for purpose, letting it bed in, and then holding ourselves to account on the outcomes.
And Deputy Mayor, how effective have the human resources set up been, and what key issues remain to be addressed?
Thank you. So before I answer that, I just want to go back to the positive improvement team, which was referenced earlier, because for me, that is a shift from individual staff groups with specific interests going to a group of people who with various levels of seniority have a collective voice and a remit to push action as part of the fundamental change. So I think it's actually been a really interesting process to see how individual staff networks have sort of come together and are working full time, and they've been taken out of their normal roles to work on this. So I think that's something that I would hope other organisations in the Fire and Rescue Service would see. It's not enough just to have a group of people who know there's a problem. You actually need to facilitate them coming together and sort of working together to be part of that change and to drive that change. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think the fundamental change that the review has initiated will be a success, because you've got that sort of driving force from within the staff who are affected most seriously themselves. In terms of the People Services Directorate, clearly there have been really serious problems, and I think getting the issues addressed will be a massive part of making sure the building blocks are in place to make sure that the huge amount of culture change work is embedded longer term. So the LFB had already identified that there were issues with the people services function, but I think the 2 individual reviews demonstrated that they were much more serious issues than we had originally envisaged. So the interim team that Andy has referenced has been driving the change. We couldn't wait to appoint a sort of new permanent director of people services to drive that change through. So, but the interim team has significant professional qualification and experience, and is basically putting forward the proposals. They're implementing the processes around the reformation, and it is a reforming, really. I think it's, in every single sense of the word, it's a reforming of the function. And they also have been working on and put forward the proposals around professional standards unit. And going back to previous comments, actually, what is the role of an HR department? They need to be able to manage the basic bits of HR, so the recruitment and the retention, but part of that is around the reputation of the organisation and driving the processes that mean that the organisation has the processes in place, so the professional standards, the policies and processes to make sure those are enforced. So nobody in the fire service would have ever said that you should have people who have behaved badly and still stay in their roles. So it's a fundamental shift, but that reforming of the people services function, which is well underway now, should mean that going forward those instances become few and far between, and that deterrent effect that the Commissioner's mentioned sort of become part of the culture. So I think we should have a positive culture, but that positive culture doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have the sort of deterrent effect of what happens if you behave badly. There are some people that actually need that in order to drive the change as well.
Commissioner. And also, Commissioner, if you can talk to us a little bit about the work that you're doing with the neurodiverse staff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to come back to the Deputy Mayor's previous point, I think sometimes, obviously, I'm coming here as Commissioner and talking at a higher level. But I want to provide some assurance that we're doing things in a practical way. So in the context of setting up the Professional Standards Unit, we've gone from everywhere, from the National Crime Agency to other police forces, to the military, to government, to local authorities, to look at where similar units exist, take the learning, and in constructing the team now, we've got a really good leader in place, supported by a good deputy. We've brought in someone on secondment who is the deputy in the NCA's Professional Standards Unit to help lead on the implementation work. So real things are happening. You know, people are going through that integrity filter to be staff inside there, and we're beginning the process of consolidating all of the various misconduct, grievance investigations. You know, got 86 of them underway at the moment into one place. So that's practical work that will have an impact if we deliver it properly and communicate it in the right way. If we think about HR operations, this first phase of restructure, reformation of HR is very focused on that. You know, a simple example of a practical change will be the fact that we're a 24/7 service, so therefore we should have a 24/7 HR helpline. That is going to get enacted, for example. But the changes will take time, they'll take time to embed, and we will need to clearly communicate them to staff and gauge whether or not they're working properly. But this is real change rather than surface level shuffling of the deck chairs. And there is, I suppose, challenge and difficulty in that. In terms of neurodiverse staff, we've got a couple of excellent secondees within the positive improvement team who are doing really good practical work to shift our approach to this. So they, for example, rewrote what was, frankly, this was just under a year ago, I'll try to figure an appropriate way to describe it, a training package that was historically delivered that just didn't really work in the culture of the London Fire Brigade. So getting people on that team to actually write the training programme from their own perspective, and this is operational officers who are dyslexic or neurodivergent in a different way. That's a good example of success. That's been very well received. The whole of the organisation has had that training package now. They're driving changes to our processes. I mean, again, it's sad, isn't it, to reflect on the fact that the London Fire Brigade is this meritocracy, this great working class institution with lots of people who don't really engage that well with the written word, but bring all these practical skills. Literally every process we ever applied to promotion or to kind of judge their progress, their talent in the organisation was written. It was bound to fail. So we're trying to strip that out. Big changes have happened on the basis of the advice there. You know, we've stopped the personal development record process as it existed because it was too literature-based, for example. That's a massive change. Some challenges in implementing something different. But so these are concrete examples of where people have stepped into the decision-making. If you come away from neurodivergence, you know, we've got, and I know you've met some of my colleagues, so some of my colleagues from the Women's Action Committee of the FBU sit on our clothing board. They have now had the opportunity to take our suppliers to task. That does not mean I've fixed our clothing supply issues. You know, that is a constant thorn in my side, but we will get there with different leadership in procurement and with their voice heard. You know, so I think we can give you lots of examples where progress is being made, but I would never be complacent enough to suggest I've somehow magically fixed it all, or we're not facing challenge and debate and tension within that process.
No, I'm hearing that, definitely. Have you assessed staff feedback from the new appraisal system, and how will you monitor its effectiveness going forward?
Not yet, but we will. So it went live in June. I think to begin with, it's about getting people to engage with the process because, again, it's fairly extraordinary. I've said it to this committee. When I joined the London Fire Brigade in 2002, the back end of 2001, start 2002, there was no appraisal system. There still wasn't one for 4,700 of our staff when I became Commissioner. So we've got no history of doing appraisal, which is to treat, basically, firefighters particularly, as somehow disposable. We're not interested in what you're doing, your talent. What you might need in terms of support and how you're doing in the workplace. Whilst we've got a system now that does that simply, the feedback I've had, and I ask on every station, is that they like the simplicity of it, they recognise it's important, but it'll take time for the culture to adjust to actually doing it. Managers to understand their responsibility and individuals their responsibility to engage with it. So we will gather the results of that as we come to the end of the financial year. and we will look at how it's succeeded and where we need to review and amend. My guess is what it will show us is that we've had to kind of get people into the mode of engagement. There won't be proper uptake of it in entirety, and I think we'll see that we've still got work to do to ensure we do understand where the talent is, and we give them proper kind of opportunities for lateral progress, for promotion. So I think it'll flush a lot of useful things out, but I think it'll be iterative over a couple of years. I don't think we get that done in one go.
Thank you. Ben, in terms of your members, what's the view of the progress being made in transforming the LFB's people services?
Well, look, I'm here representing the National Fire Brigade Union.
I understand,
so
but we haven't got a London representative.
No, but there's a few things I wouldn't mind touching on, if that's okay, Assembly Member. I think it would be helpful for you to engage with those questions with local representatives. I think they would be best placed to address that. But some of the issues that have been discussed here, one criticism we had of the London Cultural Review report was that one of the root causes for Jayden's suicide was issues around his neurodiversity. And we felt that the report was a little light in relation to recommendations and reporting back in relation to neurodiversity. And we set up, I've said it earlier, set up a review group within the Fire Brigade Union to look at the Cultural Review report and its recommendations, and actually have begun to draft some other thoughts and recommendations in and around issues of neurodiversity. It did provide a catalyst for the Fire Brigade Union to look at what support we give our members in relation to neurodiversity, understanding it and living with neurodiversity. And we have set up, or are in the process of setting up, a network by which people can come together and start to relate to one another. That meets for the first time in early next year, in early 2024. But also we're looking at the policies we have in place and the guidance we provide to our officials in relationship to neurodiversity. It was mentioned earlier, the standard setting. But when we look at all matters of equality, standards have been set repeatedly over the last 20, 30 years in the Fire and Rescue Service. And I do mean this gently, because I do, and I have been positive towards the work in the London Fire Brigade in relation to this. But the Fire Brigade Union's conference, so delegates directly from branches and fire stations right across the UK Fire and Rescue Service, have felt that the standards that have been set have not been kept to and have not been adhered to by senior leaders right across the sector. And it's the decision of our conference now that rather than await another set of standards to be brought in and likely failed against, we will design our own democratic standards of what we expect in the UK Fire and Rescue Service in relation to equality, and we will then subtly inspect and judge fire rescue services against our democratically formed standards. I don't see that sits in opposition to some of this work. I think it can sit alongside this work, but we will be putting our members of equality sections at the forefront of designing those standards and allowing them to ensure their fire and rescue services adhere to them. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And for anyone who's listening, these topics are obviously very triggering, and there is help available 24 hours a day through agencies such as the Samaritans. I do want to just end on just one point very quickly. There are people who said that they wanted to have a safe space to speak, and there's been recommendations within that. And I do hope that people who are bringing forward issues to do with racism really do feel as if there is a safe space to speak. Things that I've been hearing back from particular members of the Fire Brigade is that when you've gone through an experience, a lived experience where you've had microaggressions continually, a feeling of not being listened to, you will get upset and frustrated. And I do hope that those people who are bringing forward those issues are not judged on the fact that they're getting angry and frustrated, but that their concerns are being listened to. And that is the thing that I'm getting a bit frustrated with myself, that there are people within the fire brigade who feel as if that their conduct or their behaviour is being assessed rather than the issues of the racism that they're bringing forward.
Assembly member, that's really important feedback. I mean, if you're able to do so without breaking the confidence of those individuals, I would welcome the opportunity to hear about individual examples, because this is part of the challenge of driving change. You know, organisations in its different levels sometimes slip back into patterns of behaviour I don't want. So if those colleagues feel confident to speak on it privately to you, and you can give us some examples of that, because I believe it to be true, then we would seek to resolve that both for the individuals and take it back as a point of learning. And on the matter of race, can I just say that I think it's the one area particularly, I don't know about the service nationally, I've only ever served in London, that we find the most difficult to talk about and address. I don't understand all the reasons for that, but we are seeking to explore and understand, because I think it is one of the areas that I am still not satisfied with in terms of moving the conversation forward. It doesn't mean that we haven't done a lot to address it and engage and learn and understand, but it would be wrong to sit in front of this committee and not acknowledge that I think we still have more work to do in that space. I'm going to the AGM for the FBU Beam branch in December, where I expect to be challenged, because I think there is challenge to hear, and I need to understand how we can shift what is a difficult conversation in society, let alone inside the London Fire Brigade. But I think it is fair to acknowledge that we have more work to do in that space.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, for allowing me that last moment. Fred Edwin, who is fantastic, please highlight the work that he's doing on outreach. He's doing some great work and promoting the culture review.
Okay, we're going to have to move the meeting on. Thank you for that, Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Good morning, all. I'm very pleased, Commissioner and Deputy Mayor, to hear that you are going to deal with people that are not behaving in a correct way robustly. I would beg you to deal with it as quickly as you can. One of the biggest issues I have with the IOPC is that they do not deal with things quick enough, and it leaves families not knowing what's going to happen, and very often they're let off because there is no case to hear, but they've gone through months and sometimes many years worrying about what may or may not come from that. We've been written to by Linda Francois, mother of Jaden, as you well know, with some questions, but they require proper, considered written answers. So we'll send them to you. The committee agrees. Would you make sure that we all get answers back and that they can be dealt with as quickly as possible, because we all feel that she deserves these written answers. If I could stay on that subject, the Green Watch, I believe it was a Green Watch at that particular sad time. Are any of the Green Watch that were there at that time of that terrible event still under investigation?
Yes. So this is the third time we've gone back to that case, which speaks to the historic failure of process and analysis, speaking bluntly. So we asked for CMP, who's the external provider of the independent reporting line investigation services, to go back again to look at Jaden's case through the lens particularly of behaviours, because we'd acknowledged the institutional failings where we let Jaden down, and we did. You know, it's clear in terms of the context of support for neurodivergence, his induction into the workforce, that gathering of kind of details around when he'd started to raise alarm corporately. We'd acknowledged that. Both the coroner's report and our own internal investigations had flushed that out, and we'd driven a lot of activity to meet the institutional failures. I think one of the things that was most disappointing was that senior leaders who aren't in the London Fire Brigade now had not addressed a properly robust approach into internal investigation around behaviours with the rigour I would want. So we've given it back to that independent third party. My understanding is they have interviewed a great number of people, over 30, in the conduct of that investigation, and that they are finalising their report, and they will bring that report to the London Fire Brigade when it's concluded. I have no sight of it because it has been conducted entirely independently. I believe they have spoken to the family, members of that watch. So we're looking at everything there, from watch-led behaviours up to very senior leaders in that space. So it's a very wide-ranging investigation to understand whether there were poor behaviours alongside the institutional failings that led to that tragic decision, which we have to accept our part in poor Jayden's choice there.
Yeah, okay, so let me be very blunt. Do you think that it's fair that this was 3 years ago and we've gone back for a third investigation? Do you think that's fair on those officers that are still being investigated 3 years later? It plays into exactly what I've just said about the IOPC. Is it fair?
No. I would agree with you that it isn't, but I see no other choice, because what I have to do is get to the truth. I can only apologise to those colleagues, because that is not natural justice. It's not good for anyone.
No, it's not.
It's not. So I think it's an entirely fair challenge, and one that I hold with the deepest regret, actually, because I don't think it's fair to them. I don't think it's fair to the family of Jayden. I don't think it's fair to anyone involved, and we should have done it right the first time. But let's be clear, that was one of the primary reasons why I commissioned the independent review of culture, because I was so disappointed in our institutional approach to looking at whether or not behaviours have been part of that tragic decision-making process. So I fully accept your criticism, Assembly Member, because I think it is correct. But I think, have a responsibility to the family and the organisation, despite the burden I'm afraid it places on my colleagues, to try and get to the truth of this, whatever it is.
It is a massive burden, not just to those colleagues, but to their families as well.
Yes.
Some of them, I believe, have been actually asking for their files or their notes or what they're actually being looked into for, and are not able to get that. I believe some have been told to put in FOIs, and they are not being given information on those FOIs. I just would say it is absolutely right that if anybody has done something wrong or behaviours are incorrect, without doubt, you are absolutely right. They need to be dealt with robustly. But going back to my point about how dreadful I think the IOPC can be, it's the time it takes. It is not fair to any of those officers in Greenwatch, any or all of them, I've no idea, who are actually innocent of anything they're being looked into. This must be sped up. This must be dealt with. And a resolution has got to be found very, very quickly on this particular issue.
You know, full respect to that challenge. The report, as I understand it, is due to land in the next 2 weeks. Obviously, you know, having been given that responsibility, they're clear they've got to discharge that with a real rigour, because they know that whatever the results of this, it has a consequence for all parties, both those being investigated and, of course, most importantly, the family of Jayden. But I think your point is well made. It's why we must succeed in the setting up of a professional standards unit that expedites these processes, because, again, for sake of full transparency, with that volume of complaints, some people have been suspended for longer than I would like, have been under investigation for longer than I would like, and that is not natural justice either. So I know we have more to do in this space. I welcome the challenge, and I can only apologise on that basis to those who are impacted. But what I will say, as your Commissioner, is I believe I have a duty to get to the truth of the matter, whatever that might be, I'm afraid. But fully accept your points. They are well made.
OK, well, I sincerely hope that we have closure on this by the end of this year, so at least those families, and if they're wrong, they need to be dealt with, but if they're not, they need closure so they can start 2024, hopefully knowing that this isn't hanging over them. And whilst I completely understand the family's issues, Jayden's family's views, because it's a dreadful situation all round. Are we still on track to launch the Professional Standards Unit next month?
Yes, I'll meet weekly because I've got an interest in this alongside the other kind of changes in our HR and people services to make sure that we are on track. And the answer is yes. So grossly simplified policies and procedures that underpin it are in consultation now with colleagues from all the representative bodies. We have begun the process of wider team recruitment now that we've got the leadership of the unit in place. I expect that to be up and running in December, and actually I would welcome the views of my colleague sitting next to me, Martin, who obviously chairs the Independent Culture Review and has great experience in another regulatory space, in coming and having a look at that to satisfy that panel as to whether or not we're heading in the right direction, whether everything from whistleblowing to those processes and the way we approach investigation and case handling is fit for purpose, because I think that's important. I think we need to bring that in a transparent way to his panel for consideration. But I do expect that to be up and running, because that is not a promise that we should break.
No, I agree, and I wish you well with this, because the firefighters are very brave, as we know. The vast majority of them are exceptionally hard, and they deserve to be in a place that they feel safe and happy working in. So I support you on those efforts. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Next we come to Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, if I can start with you. We had the conversation earlier about naming people who were dismissed for misconduct. Does the union have a view on if that's a positive thing?
Well, we've not had that discussion as a trade union as of yet, and I can see there being benefits on a personal level to why we would want to move across to that. I think and I understand why it becomes a huge focus in this discussion, because all of us want to do something relatively quickly to see some systematic changes. But I don't think once we're looking for short-term outcomes, we are addressing root causes of culture. And I think the focus of the debate should be around how do we get to the hub of what's going on in the UK Fire and Rescue Service and seek to change that. Things like DBS checks, the naming of people that have been dismissed, for instance, for misconduct, are elements of which we could see some very small improvements on. However, it won't change the culture and the institutional culture within the Fire and Rescue Service. And I think that's what we are trying to progress in when we are talking about our Equality Matters campaign, is how we extend that into looking at behaviours, looking at interactions in workplaces. Look, I'm a little bit amazed that it's been said here, and the Commissioner, I'm sure, will come back on this. It should not be the case that anyone is under investigation or suspended but don't know why. That shouldn't be the case. I know it's been said here, and I really don't understand how that can be particularly right. And more broadly around the length of time, one thing I would say is I understand there are difficulties in addressing some issues. However, and it's a cause for our own organisation, when serious matters like this are brought to us, it's a responsibility on us all to deal with them at speed and not allow things to go on into years, frankly. I'm not sure many of them should take much more than months. We face similar challenges in and around that, but what that does is it has a great impact, and I think it's been said here, on both the defendant or the person under investigation in that matter, but equally the victim on the other side of things. And I think we've got to be conscious of both of those individuals.
Thank you. Commissioner, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think my colleague deserves a response on that, actually, and it also answers in part the bit I didn't respond to that Susan had raised. So my understanding is that those colleagues involved in that specific process, and every process I'm aware of, are clear about why they're being investigated. So that's the first thing to say. I think that is absolutely clear why they're being investigated and why allegations are being put to them. In the context of the FOIs, I'm going to take that away and check again. But my view on this is that we've got nothing to hide, and that if there's any barriers to disclosure of information, it will be because so many people are involved in the investigation, and there are matters of individual rights in the context of breach of data, and even if you redact names, people being identifiable within the specifics of a team or a workplace. So we have to tread in that space with great caution, and we'll be advised as a result. But, again, Susan, I would genuinely be grateful if those people who've given you that confidence felt they were able to articulate where they think we've been either disproportionate or unfair in our failure to release information, and you have a promise from me as Commissioner we will go back and look at that. So I think they deserve that, particularly in the context of the pressure they face.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I can dive into some questions about the complaints process. Obviously it's been bubbling throughout this whole meeting, but you'll know well that Nazir Afzal at the end of his culture review talked about lack of confidence in the complaints process being a real issue. Now, when I've asked you about this before, and my colleagues have, you've talked about an external complaints process, and you've talked about that again today. However, I've spoken to a fair few officers, and I just want to echo some of the words of my colleagues, that what they had to say was pretty grim and depressing, and I can hear loud and clear that you accept that too, but I feel like we need to express it. And I guess that my first question really is, it's an external complaints process, but at some point it has to come back to the London Fire Brigade. So can I ask about the process of how that happens, and if it truly is an external complaints process, if ultimately the Fire Brigade are then making the decisions?
So there's a number of questions there. The first thing to say would be acknowledge the experience of colleagues who have obviously spoken to you. So actually our real issue has gone from one of confidence in external reporting to one of dealing with the volume. So we've gone from a place where there was no confidence in the internal reporting process to one where a great many more people have felt very confident to call the process, but then have been, the external reporting line, but then been disappointed in the length of time it takes to resolve. This is partly volume. Although we're a big organisation, we're facing a volume of complaint there that to do properly does take time. 86 live investigations. The most serious kind of level of misconduct where people are potentially going to lose their right to be employed in this occupation, and therefore we've got to do it properly. And there is a resource issue in that. So part of the challenge has not been really the external process, but exactly as you've said, when it comes back in, because we do have the duty as an employer to then make that employment decision. An external party cannot do that. They can investigate, they can present the findings of their investigation, and then we take that as evidence into whatever process then falls. We've needed to make sure that we didn't repeat the mistakes of the past in that, and some of the delay has been because we needed to put a series of people through a process to train them, first of all, to hear those most serious proceedings and take a decision internally in the right way. We've had to talk to our colleagues from the representative bodies to ensure that they were comfortable with that, because there is actually a contractual element to this. And then we've had to schedule the hearings. So I think you're right to highlight the delay. I think if you're an officer in the middle of that, it's very difficult. What I would say as a caveat to that is that this is also part of the reckoning, that this is part of the challenge moving forward, that this is how we're going to do business. What I won't apologise for is the rigour and the fact that everyone can be subject to that, from commissioner to firefighter. And that, I'm afraid, as a leader in this organisation, you may well find yourself as part of those processes, either in reporting into them or being subject to them, and we have to play it with a straight bat. So I think it is pressure in a different way, but that's also part of sorting the organisation out, and is part of the leadership responsibilities of anyone who wants to take that responsibility in LFB. What we've got to do is right by them to do it quicker, promptly, professionally led, maintaining the confidence in that external reporting piece. I think we're in a very different place now because of the volume of concluding processes I can see just across the last month, really. You know, we've accelerated it because we've got that cadre of, I think it was 34 people trained. So we've got a cadre of consistently trained people to hear those discipline proceedings. And we are working our way through, and there's some pressure on those people, a real volume of things coming to final conclusion. Can I just say a big thank you, actually, to London Region reps, because I sometimes forget that for every time we run a discipline process, inevitably there is a trade union representative there, and I know they are also under colossal pressure as a result of that. And I do thank them for their professionalism and actually their responsibility in representing their colleagues regardless of the allegations made.
Thank you. I've heard you say this before about the volume of complaints being a recognition of more confidence in the process, and I don't disagree with that. However, it doesn't mean, and I don't think you're suggesting this, that there's complete confidence in the process.
No.
I want to ask you a more serious question, I suppose, about power, and you started to allude it there. We had a meeting recently about women in the London Fire Brigade, and we had several women in senior leadership come to the meeting. I spoke to the Secretariat to say that I actually wanted to hear from female firefighters, because the nature of power is if you're in senior leadership, you may be, not definitely, but you may be less likely to speak about things that are going on the ground. And when I have met with the London Fire Brigade, they've said this immensely so, and particularly where there's intersectionality, so say black women or LGBT men are saying the kind of minority on minority are making these things particularly difficult. It's a big question, but what are you doing about the nature of that firefighters are saying to us as Assembly members, that they don't have confidence in management to deal with the complaints process properly, and even when there is a result, the fact it's coming back to the Fire Brigade means that they don't have the confidence in those people to make those decisions?
I think the only answer to that is to demonstrate we're doing it the right way, to demonstrate by outcomes rather than words that we're taking a grip of it. And the reality is, I think for people who've been traumatised by their experience in the London Fire Brigade at times, you know, it would be very hard to win their trust. And nor do we necessarily deserve it until there's a consolidated period of a changed environment. So I haven't got a simple answer for that, because otherwise it's just warm words. I think what we have to do is demonstrate in our actions that we're doing the right thing, and try and drive a generational change in the leadership approach. You know, can I just say as well, in defence of many, many excellent officers in the London Fire Brigade, because I've got over 1,200 leaders stretching from leading firefighter to deputy commissioner in the London Fire Brigade. Many of them are doing it the right way, and I can see that in some of the outcomes. Inevitably, with that number of leaders, I have definitely still got people who don't do the right thing, who try and keep things locally contained in an inappropriate manner, who exercise the wrong kind of relationships of power. And actually, if I look at our suspensions, there is a very wide range of ranks in those suspensions. You know, this is not just focused at firefighter level. I acknowledge that part of changing the culture of the London Fire Brigade, and it is probably the most important function actually, is to change the culture of leadership. It speaks to Ben's point, which is you can do all the discipline you want, but it is much bigger than that. You know, it's about how you take what is the courageous intent of firefighters out on the incident ground and make sure they match that with their behaviours in the workplace, because it's all there. You know, we've got all the advantages as an organisation. People are inevitably heroic and public service orientated, but they don't always demonstrate those behaviours consistently in the workplace. So the answer is we have to keep all of this process of change moving. The education, the selection of the right leaders, the outing of people who don't do the right thing, the constant checking in with colleagues who are frankly marginalised at times. I would acknowledge that. And so making sure we can hear their voice and that we don't try and claim something that we haven't delivered with them either, whilst also managing expectations and giving credit to the very large number of people inside the London Fire Brigade who really do want this change and are working very hard to deliver it.
Thank you. So on the constant checking in, what specifically are you doing about that? And I'll caveat this by saying that they said you as a commissioner were excellent at this. They're talking more about the next few levels. They feel like they're not being heard, some of those staff networks.
So I've seen a level of engagement in the London Fire Brigade I've never seen before. You know, we've got our DACs out there. I've got my borough commanders out there. You know, as part of the values work that's happening now, every single rank of leader is involved in face-to-face conversation on at least 3 occasions between now and March. I think what you speak to, though, Zach, is conversations are fine. You've got to have the skills to draw the information out of people in a way that they feel safe to provide, and we're not there yet. That's about a generational process of education, of awareness, because it's not even necessarily about overt behaviours. It's about understanding that if you have an entirely different lived experience, which is so valuable to us in London and the service we provide, you've got to come from another angle to hear that and really seek it out in what at times can be quite an isolating workplace potentially, not because anyone's behaving very badly, but just because people have to think carefully about including difference and value in it. So I think the answer is we engage continuously. Some of my colleagues are better at it than others. I've got some excellent leaders in the organisation who are out there all the time, and I think if you went to those spaces and spoke to people who'd engage with them, they would tell you it's not just me. It can't just be me. I'm not going to change a whole organisation. That's unhealthy. That's heroic leadership at its worst. It's not going to solve the institutional issues that Ben has talked of, that I've talked of in the past. It's got to be driven all the way down through the structures, but that will take time. And again, I don't want to damn all my leaders in that, because I've got people doing extraordinary things on a daily basis who are really committed to this, but I know we're missing people. I know people still feel isolated.
Thank you.
All I'm going to do is promise we'll get to them.
I'm going to come to Ben in a second. It's good to hear you that, because at the beginning you talked about senior officers visiting every fire station, and whilst that's excellent and I'd applaud it, obviously if they're just visiting, that could actually make things worse, because everyone just makes sure everything looks pretty, everyone says everything's brilliant, and nothing actually
I'll just say something on this. Credit to the Fire Brigades Union. That is absolutely not my experience on a London fire station. I don't know what it's like in other organisations, but I get read my fortune on an almost daily basis on fire stations. so
Cool.
no.
Can I ask you one more question before I bring in Ben? So in terms of abuse of power, one firefighter talked to me about Freemason insignia. They said it was on a turntable, and they were a woman from an ethnic minority, and they talked about knowing the Freemasons' attitude both to, allegedly, to ethnic minorities and to women. They don't want to go up that ladder. What are you doing to make sure that there's no Freemason, not just Freemason insignia on equipment, that's the first step, but about Freemason transparency more generally?
So in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, the Freemasons donated £2.5 million to the London Fire Brigade, which was supported by the then Commissioner and the Mayor, because there was a desperate need for that equipment. My view, and I've said it into this committee, is that public funds should pay for emergency service equipment. And credit to the Mayor, he agrees with that. So moving forward, you will not see me turn into any charitable institution to provide funding into the London Fire Brigade, because I do not believe it appropriate. I believe my job as Commissioner is to come and ask, on the basis of an evidence-backed case, for the equipment and the support and the resourcing we need. I am unlikely to remove those symbols. I am not a Freemason, and I would suggest that we need to ensure that people declare openly their membership of that as much as they declare membership of any organisation that might have barriers to openly joining it, because that can impact promotion and relationships and networks of power and patronage inside an organisation. But the Freemasons aren't the only example of that. And despite the good charitable works they do, I do not intend moving forward to turn to any organisation for funding to the London Fire Brigade. But at the same time, I do have to acknowledge that they raised £2.5 million and supplied that equipment, which has been used many times operationally to save lives in London. So whilst I respect the views of my colleague that you've just expressed, I don't intend to move forwards in that way, because I think public funding has to support public services. I have to also acknowledge that we received £2.5 million. It bought state-of-the-art kit, and that saved a lot of people in London.
I'm going to push back on that slightly. People with problematic views shouldn't be able to not have problematic views just because they're donating large amounts of money. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah, of course I do. That's why moving forward we won't engage in that way. But what I would say is that I'm also not in a position to simply kind of disrespect that contribution when I wasn't part of the decision-making process. And I accept the colleague you've just described, their level of discomfort about this. I can understand why. I can understand why they might feel that. And I have full respect for that. But at the same time, I can't disrespect that level of contribution, and I won't make promises I'm not going to keep or play to a gallery in that sense. I can only tell you about my decision-making, my intent, and how we move forwards in that space.
I think unjust organisations do deserve disrespect, but I can hear we agree to disagree. Ben, I know you wanted to come in.
Well, it was first of all just to... I knew I'd forget that at some point. It was first of all to say, look, we... when the Commissioner and the London Fire Brigade brought in the CMP, we were broadly in support of that and have maintained that support throughout it. And the focus of your question was, I think, around people not having the confidence that things would be dealt with correctly. And I still think that is the case. Not as bad as what it was. There has been improvement in relation to that, as the Commissioner's outlaid there. But I think there's a slightly different tone now to what's being said of why people aren't coming forward. And I think we need to consider how we address that too. Fiona and I were both at meeting firefighters, London firefighters, at the Women's Action Committee recently, and we shared with them and we heard their experiences, and the same was replicated in a beam meeting I went to of London firefighters a few months back too, and that is that whilst they now have the confidence that the senior leadership is going to hear the concerns they have and the complaint they may have, they're now feeling that because of the culture review, because of the way things are being viewed in the London Fire Brigade, but broadly as well, that they are then put under some spotlight as the person that was challenging the so-called fire service banter culture. And I think that's something else that provides a challenge to us as well. And that's, you know, the issue I wanted to talk about and why I indicated to come. Some of the movement in the questions after that, I think, excite some debate and some discussion about. You brought up the Freemasons across the Fire and Rescue Service. I'm not sure of the involvement in the London Fire Brigade, but there's an organisation, part of the Plymouth Brethren, the Rapid Relief Team, that go out and provide resources on fire grounds. Well, the truth is they hold serious transphobic and homophobic views, in truth, and I'm not sure we should be supporting that across the Fire and Rescue Service. So I think that debate can carry on, because I'm sure there are other supporting agencies around the Fire and Rescue Service that, you know, if we are being true to changing culture, we need to look into the ethics of those groups as well, and whether we need to move away or provide that ourselves. And I suppose that's a challenge to you as an authority and to the Mayor, that actually if you fund the Fire and Rescue Service correctly, we don't need the charitable donations to buy equipment and provide support at incident grounds. So that's a challenge, I think, more so to you than actually the Commissioner.
Thanks, Ben. Really appreciated it. And then just a final question to Commissioner, if I can beg the Chair's forgiveness. It's about data, so it's a two-part question. One is around intersectionality we just discussed. Would you consider asking the People Department to start collecting intersectional data on people? And the second is about data around complaints. So do we know if people who have been complained about have left for service before their complaint has been completed, in which case we wouldn't know that they've been dismissed for a complaint, they just kind of voluntarily left? And also at the same time, people who have made complaints, who have lost faith in the system and actually just left the brigade, do we have data on that too?
So the answer is we're already collecting data in relation to intersectionality in almost every way you can imagine. Actually, it's quite interesting, the Inspectorate's view on this is that we're a very data-rich organisation. Our historical failing, and I genuinely do not believe it's the case now because of the level of collation, analysis and action delivered as a result of it. But historically, we just hadn't used the data to its full advantage. So yes, we do. We look at everything from protected characteristics to length of service, to your skills, to your sickness, everything. And in terms of the complaint process, as we move forward into the Professional Standards Unit, we will be driving further intersectional analysis of both complaint, failed resolution, all of it. We already do some of that, but I think we could do more. We just have to tread carefully in that space, because some of the advice we got from external experts actually is that in the initial stages, to drive confidence in it, you almost shouldn't be asking what the characteristic of someone is. There's something about protecting the identity of people and their vulnerability. I think we might be past some of that now, and we will be able to therefore drive, which is our desire, a greater kind of dissection of that complaint process, because that is important to understand, very important in fact.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Assemblymember Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Martin, you've been sitting there so patiently. Don't perk up. My colleagues will ask you questions. I'm just giving you the heads up, just in case you've checked out.
Not at all.
Good. I just thought it'd be good to warn you that someone is actually going to speak to you in the course of this meeting. Thank you for your patience. I'm come to the Commissioner, who's done nothing but speak, but we pay you for that. It is your job. It's not all part of your job. What I want to talk about is DBS checks. So currently you have an increased level of DBS checks. Are you happy at this increased level, or would you like to go further?
No, we're going to go to the furthest level of it. We've made a decision internally, so we will be applying enhanced DBS. We've had some advice since I last came to the committee that there isn't a barrier, thanks to the legislative change I referred to earlier, to us implementing enhanced. So we've gone back, we sought clarity, and I can only really once again thank both the Mayor, Susan, the Minister, yourself, who I know all in different ways kind of applied pressure into kind of government and legislation to see what I think has been a very important shift for the National Fire Service, but definitely London. So we are in the process of enacting enhanced disclosure across the entire workforce. It'll be on a cycle, existing employees, everyone, and new entrants.
Are you... That's a great innovation, of course, but isn't there potential that this could leave you with other challenges when these DBS checks could throw up things that you need to confront?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's part of being an open and transparent organisation. So again, you know, in terms of our maturity of thinking around this, we will apply a traffic light system that is often seen in other uniformed services, which looks at the level of offence that might be disclosed. So, for example, if I've got an existing employee who's never been mandated to disclose, because of the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, a previous offence, we will judge it in terms of the nature of that offence. I would suggest that if it's a sexual crime or a violent crime, you haven't got a place in the London Fire Brigade. If it's offences of another nature, whether it's driving or a lower level of a drugs offence, potentially like the military, we will take it on a case-by-case basis. Because we have to recognise, actually, that we draw from sometimes significantly disadvantaged sections of society who are more prone to being involved in criminal activity. I'm just stating a fact here. And that's in the I can think of my own wider family in this context, in terms of where people grow up and what they're exposed to. So we've got to take a mature approach to this. But what I do want to know is what you've done. And then if it's the most serious sort of offence, I'm afraid, because of the responsibilities to the public, there is no place for you.
I'm glad to hear you say that and acknowledge that you draw from a wider pool than most professions, because you do offer something I think is quite unique. Coming from where I come from, the boys I grew up with, checkered past would be a term that you could use, but also the Fire Brigade was a way out. So I'm very glad to hear you say that. I'd just like to quickly turn to the union. What is it your take on enhanced DBS checks? Do you think that's a great innovation? Do you think it's overkill for staff? Will it be rolled out nationally?
Well, the debate around DBS checks is going on broadly across every fire and rescue service. It's causing some challenges, there's no doubt. I think it was helpful the Commissioner brought in to the conversation there around the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. I think one of the concerns we've got is how the two things can interact. And how, I suppose, the devil is in the detail on how we respond to certain cases. Look, we hold the view that that if people within the Fire and Rescue Service, even if they're members of the Fire Brigade Union, to be absolutely clear, are homophobic, transphobic, racist, misogynists, the list unfortunately does go on, then they don't have a place in our fire service, they don't have a place in the Fire Brigade Union. But we also hold the view that people over time can mature and change their views, and I think we need to be conscious of that too. You know, we need to be proud of the education the fire service gives people when they become a member of it. I think we're proud in the union of the education we can give to people. If after that education they still hold those terrible views, then that is when we need to intervene and act. There is no doubt about it. But I do think we just need to work through the detail of what happens after the implementation of something like enhanced DBS checks and what impact that can have on the wider workforce and membership of the Fire Brigade Union.
Thank you. Just quickly, last thing to the Commissioner. I just want a little clarification for you. Imagine someone does a DBS check, does throw something up. Will you be looking at this case-by-case situation and holding it against their service, particularly if, because what I'm imagining is they've done something when they were a bit younger. As your colleague from the union has said, they've matured, they've moved, that's reflected in their good service. Will that be placed against whatever the DBS check throws up?
Apologies, if I could come to Martin afterwards. I think Martin's got some really interesting views. I've discussed with Martin about this previously. The answer is yes, it has to be on a case-by-case basis, because everyone's an individual within the context of both an offence that might have been committed, the details of that offence, the background to it. We've got to take that approach, because otherwise, again, we're playing to a gallery, aren't we? We're providing a headline. It doesn't mean a relaxing of the standards, not at all. What it means is that I don't want to deny people social capital, the chance to be real ambassadors in their own communities if the level of offence is justifiably tolerable. But there is a fairly rigorous risk assessment process that I've seen now that we will apply, and we will work through it case by case. But it needs to be sensible and mature rather than the kind of seeking to kind of play to the extremity of the debate.
Okay.
Because it's true, this is one of the last great working class institutions. People sometimes do come to us, for example, having juvenile records. What we've got to do at each point is judge the threshold at which that offence has occurred and whether they represent a risk to the community, because in the end, that is the priority, isn't it? You know, so I think, again, we're willing to learn on this. I had a very interesting conversation with James Timpson, who runs Timpson's Locksmiths recently.
Yep.
You know, a very long conversation. He's coming in with colleagues from the Ministry of Justice in January to look at our training, and we're going to discuss further actually how he has approached the employment of offenders. Now, it's a different context with different risk, but he had some very interesting things to say about that, which alongside a risk assessment process, some of the stuff that Martin might talk about in his experience, means we will take a considered and mature approach to this that focuses primarily, though, on the risk presented to Londoners and ensuring that everyone holds themselves to the highest standards of behaviour.
Thank you. Thank you.
I asked about this. I've been in post about 7 or 8 weeks, and I was very surprised that firefighters didn't have to undergo enhanced DBS checks. I had to have one simply to enter the Home Office to advise them on Windrush compensation. So there seems to be a much lower threshold in other professions. The paramount principle, it seems to me, is protection of the public. As a firefighter, you are entering people's homes, you are carrying their children, you know, down ladders and stairs. People need to have confidence that nobody has a record that involves sexual impropriety. But equally, it seems to me, two other things need to be paramount. One is proportionality, where you would balance service against nature of offence, and whether it was a juvenile offence and somebody may be 35. Again, from my background, the first time I appeared as a barrister in a Crown Court, one of my primary school mates was in the dock in another case. So I've kind of seen that range. And I think, so you've got proportionality, and also a right of appeal. It seems to me that to have confidence in that process, you probably need an independent person as a check or balance on that. And I'll talk a lot about regulation, because it's a big part of what I do within the health law and employment law stuff that I do. But it does come at a cost. You're going to have these safeguards in place, and you're going to have confidence and independence. And I do understand, I've been very disturbed to hear members saying that there's a lack of confidence in process because people seem to be marking their own homework. Maybe the person you're complaining about is your line manager, who has the ability to kick your complaint into the long grass, etc. I think independence is what's needed at a very early stage in decision making, but you've got to pay people to do it, and they've got to be well trained.
Yeah, the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. So I think Martin Forde has come up with some really good ideas, and I think this is one of the reasons we've been encouraging the Fire Brigade to bring in external people who haven't got a particular long relationship with the fire service, because I think that we need that external perspective to help us. The point I wanted to make, however, was when it is a case-by-case basis, yes, that's right. However, the case-by-case, one of the criteria for people being treated potentially more leniently than others has to move away from people thinking they're all right, really, or that they know them and are known to them. So you have to take out that perception of nepotism from the system. So it has to be clear to people why some people might be being treated differently than others. And it has to be a fair process. It can't be about who they know within the service, or simply that they've been there for a long time. So there has to be the element of objectivity, and actually having an external voice or perception of sort of perspective within that process can be one of the ways that fairness can be brought in when you're going to have something that inevitably could lead to people thinking, well, I don't understand why that person got treated differently than that person. There has to be an element of external scrutiny on that.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And actually it speaks to Martin's point, and it's part of the reasons for wanting firefighting to effectively become a regulated profession in some ways, because I think that decision making may well best lie outside the boundaries of the London Fire Brigade to maintain confidence in it, but there is a burden to that, because there's going to be numbers potentially, and you want it set against a clear set of, I would argue, national benchmarks about what we expect of firefighters in the community. So that's work to be done, but I mean very useful questions actually that speak to the national debate that's ongoing.
Thank you. I just want to say I really appreciate your understanding of the need for nuance. I think that's going to be very important. I think your call for a regulated service is different because that's going to take a lot of time, I imagine. So you might be able to do it just through independence in the same way you've set up this independent board. I suggest that's quicker and it gives you an ability to set it up with that nuance embedded. The last thing I'll say, the way to maintain the confidence in the way Baroness Twycross is speaking is to have the criteria definitely written out before anybody enters the room, so you can see it from miles, as my mum would say. You know, I think that's going to be important, but it's going to be important for people in the service to keep their morale up, that you have a look at all of these things. But thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Just coming to our last section of the meeting, Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Some questions for Martin. Could you give us an overview of the role of the advisory panel and of your role as independent chair?
Yeah. So when I applied, I obviously looked at the criteria. I had already read the damning report as a matter of just of interest. I'm interested in these sorts of things, and obviously read about Jaden's case as well. And I've now been at the bar for nearly 40 years, and I'm quite keen to do things which give a little back. My background is mainly in clinical negligence and related regulation of the health professions, and they are the most regulated professions in the country. So both nurses and doctors and chiropractors and osteopaths, you name it, I've probably acted for them. And some employment law around NHS whistleblowing, which is quite a hot topic at the moment. And it seemed to me that that combination of my court kind of experience and my interest in the fire service generally. My brother is a part-time fire officer in the States, and I've been various places in the world with him. There's this automatic camaraderie if he walks into a fire station and starts talking about equipment. So we all know that they do a very difficult job. They are incredibly brave. But it was very disturbing to read that as an organisation they had these problems. And they're deeply embedded. I would like to think they're generational and more my kind of age group than younger ones. But my son, who was 31 yesterday, experienced appalling abuse as a 15-year-old playing football, which was really children aping the views of parents. So some of these views are very, I'm afraid, deep-seated. I have been impressed talking to Andy about his commitment to process, but again, listening to the questions, I'm fully aware that management and even middle management can come up with lots of platitudes in meetings such as these, but what is happening at grassroots level? So I have my first visit to my local Clapham police station on Thursday. I'll be very interested to see the mix in terms of ethnicity. I've lived in South London now since the middle 80s, so I'm pretty familiar with the demographic and the way it changes. So since I've first started meeting there, we've had an explosion of Portuguese migrants, French-speaking West Africans. My younger two children were at school with lots of Somalis. And what I've noticed is that the stations quite often don't reflect the communities they serve. Now that's, I suspect, mainly because of the cost of living in London. But if you've got firefighters that are serving a diverse community, but who then go home to a fairly monolithic one, then they may not have any real cultural understanding of the people they serve. So one of the things that Andy and I have discussed is what happens during training and induction. Do firefighters get any protected time, paid time, to explore their neighbourhood? Now, those of us who have parents have all, had excited children coming back who've had the local fire service visits, so they can clamber all over their fire tender. And my son was very disappointed when he wasn't allowed, like Fireman Sam, he was 6 at the time, not 31, down the pole because of health and safety reasons. And that's great community PR, doing the fates but what's happening about going into these schools and saying you could be a firefighter as a young female firefighter or a young ethnic minority firefighter. Really interested to listen to what you had to say about intersection, because I do think those statistics are absolutely vital, because there's absolutely no doubt that in my profession I've had an easier time as a black man than if I was a black female barrister, And when we had a recent survey on earnings, bottom of the pile were black and Asian female barristers, followed by black or Asian male barristers, and of course the usual suspects tended to be the highest earners. So I think if you're not part of that, the community that you're serving, you need to know about it, and you need to understand local hotspots and local attitudes, local customs, local traditions, perhaps certain festivals that might cause more of a fire hazard than others, not just bonfire night. There might be other religious festivals where there could be a risk. I think you need to have a diversity within the fire brigade in terms of cultural understanding and even language. You know, if you have somebody who's trying to explain to you what the particular problem is, and there's nobody who can translate in an emergency, it seems to me that's another potential deficiency. I'm very interested to hear what Andy's had to say about the demographic of recruitment, because obviously lots of firefighters bring to the table skills which are not necessarily and don't need to be academic. Very interested to hear what he has to say about promotion and the barriers to promotion if you've got people doing lengthy written tests who may suffer badly with dyspraxia or dyslexia. And that obviously needs looking at in some detail. I'm very impressed by my panel. So I have retired firefighters, female firefighters, both of the major trade unions who seem to be showing a real commitment. I'm meeting 3 Grenfell groups this evening, organised by Donna Peters, who's one of the community outreach people that Andy's employed. I speak to her almost daily. She's quite brilliant. Because, again, I want to find out whether those who live in high-rise... I had one meeting with a young man and there's a young man on our committee who lost his mother in a fire, and saying simple things like, to this day in his tower block, there's no sprinkler system, but neither are there fire extinguishers, both at the exit from the lift and the exit from the stairs, which are on opposite sides of the building. Somebody sighted the extinguisher in the middle of those 2 exits. So simple things like that. Are they getting visits? Are they getting advice? What's happening? I mean, there's an estate near me in Stockwell where at bonfire night the kids think it's a good idea to light the big industrial bins. But there are also homeless people who do it because they need to keep warm. And I think having local knowledge about those sorts of incidents and instances is important. I've also discovered that there's not necessarily the interaction between different first responders. So it seems to me that if you attend my home because I need an ambulance, but you happen to notice that I've got 3 electric scooters charging in my hallway with one plug, it might be quite a good idea to tip off the fire brigade that you're concerned about that, even as a paramedic. Similarly, if you were one of the civilian police officers and you notice that there's some activity that's going on, I was told that a member of the public said, "Are you going to tell the fire brigade that these children are, throwing bangers and lighting bins?" That's not my pay grade. It seemed to me that was a poor response. So I think there's a lot for us to do, but what I don't want it to be a talking shop. I've made it very clear. We need achievable gains. We need to look at the recommendations and scrutinise them as you have, and really hold Andy's feet to the fire, it seems to me, because I don't want to be here in a year's time saying, well, we've done this, we've done that. I've visited lots of fire stations and I've stood around braziers and chatted to people, but that's all I've done. So we are looking to publish agendas, publish minutes around confidence in process and regulation. I'm quite keen for us to have a separate email inbox so that if people don't have confidence in the current structures or even the new one, that concerns can be brought direct to me and my committee. I've had a long look at process, and some of you will be aware I did a report for the Labour Party where I made a lot of recommendations around process. It seems to me the process needs to be transparent. It needs to be predictable. So if you're going to stop people thinking that who you know prevents you getting disciplined or reduces your sanction, that's something that doesn't engender confidence. What the health regulators tend to do is they will set out the basic aims of regulation and the standards to which you're to be held, and then they will set out various aspects of misconduct that are likely to lead to various sanctions, which might be a retraining matter, might be a suspension, might be an erasure from the relevant register. So there's a degree of predictability. They also set out mitigating circumstances, which might be it's a one-off length of service early in a career or late in a distinguished career, and aggravating matters such as you're a repeat offender, you're already on a warning. And again, I think those things, as Sean was saying, they need to be published so that people can actually say, I've gone on the website, this is what I'm looking at for this type of behaviour. So you might have multiple microaggressions being as put down as banter, but being as serious as one particularly serious comment. But I think people need to know where they stand, and I do think an independent component is important, certainly at an appellate level. Even if you're not going to have it at first instance, you certainly want people to feel that there's been an independent look at a decision that they're unhappy with. So those are the various ways that I would like to think that I can help. And I extend an invitation to my emails in the public domain. So if any of you have anecdotes or concerns, please email me direct and say, I've spoken. Because I think as Assembly members, you're going to be more trusted than the existing hierarchy within the LFB, inevitably. And therefore, I think I'll get a much better understanding, which I can then take on to the rest of the committee, of what's really happening at grassroots level. It seems to me there's no allegation that attitudes have impacted upon performance during the course of firefighting. But I am concerned if women or ethnic minorities or LGBTQ members of the force are having a miserable time, feeling they're being bullied, metaphorically, if not actually crying themselves to sleep, dreading going to work, not feeling it's a safe environment, that you're not going to get the best out of people like that. Equally, I want to make it very clear that this is not a witch hunt. It's not, as apparently some people describe the survey, kind of, wokery. This is about basic respect. All of us deserve to be able to go to work and feel that we will be respected as human beings. I think a lot of the low-level racism in particular is around ignorance, and it's around a lack of exposure. It'd be very interesting talking to firefighters to see if they have, let's say, one black or Asian colleague, have they actually visited them in their home environment? Have they socialised with them outside work? Do they know anything about them? Do they know the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim, for instance? Do they understand the various religious conventions or celebrations? I think a lot of this low-level banter, which I was subjected to throughout my childhood, my nickname at my school, where I was the only black kid in the 650, was Chalky, because I was black, and they thought it was funny to give me a white moniker, which I put up with till I was about 14, and then I made it very clear I wasn't prepared to be addressed in that way. But I'm sure my peers would have said it was banter, and I think we need to try and get across to people just how hurtful they can be with misplaced jokes. Obviously, the report came up with horrific examples of, bacon in a Muslim officer's boots and that sort of thing, which is just absolutely disgraceful. And why anybody would think that's funny, frankly, is beyond me. But equally, I don't want people to be defensive. So I had to give a lecture to 250 judges on microaggressions from the bench, would you believe, saying things to them such as, if you do have an ethnic minority barrister or a female barrister and you lean forward as a male barrister and say that's not the way we do things, it's absolutely professionally humiliating in front of your professional and lay client, because it makes it seem as if you don't know what you're doing in court. And who is the we? to Martin Forde, born in Farnham Common in Buckinghamshire. Well, why aren't I part of the we, if you're going to make that type of comment? And so I think it's getting across to people that in all types of professions, all walks of life, even rivalry between religions and races. We have a Nigerian cleaning company in my chambers, and if I give a name to our head cleaner, which is Nigerian, she can identify the tribe and the area. And the last time I tried, she'd looked around and she said to me, Martin, he's Igbo. They're all liars, because she's Yoruba. You know, and I think sometimes for our majority white indigenous population to understand that there are also microaggressions between ethnic groups they might see as homogenous, because if you saw Margaret and I walking along together, you wouldn't know whether she was Afro-Caribbean like myself or whether I was West African as she is. So I think that there's a lot of subtlety and nuance around this, and I'm very, very keen that perhaps some of those with less attractive attitudes don't feel that this is any kind of witch hunt as far as they're concerned. They may need some gentle persuasion. So, for instance, misogyny. I've often said to people in that kind of space, how would you feel if your mother or your sister was subjected to this? Because I have had an administrative member of staff, because I think it's important to include them, who's now left the LFB, who contacted me direct and said, you know, from the moment she started, there was speculation about her bra cup size or who would sleep with her first. And she was supposed to put up with this, and it was very, very damaging to her mental health. So I think we also need to make sure we're looking after the backroom staff. It's not just the firefighters. It's a big organisation, and there's probably more diversity in the administrative side, as I've witnessed it myself. But you also need to know that those people feel valued within the service as well.
Thank you very much, Mon, for your thoughtful answer, which I think has actually answered my next question as well, so thank you. So then, turning to the Commissioner, I appreciate that it's fairly early days for the panel, but can you give us a specific example of when the panel has acted as that critical friend and caused you to change your approach on an issue, or if you don't have a specific example, the kinds of issues that you would envisage that happening on?
I haven't got a specific example, because the first meeting, which was long, was about a private session for the panel to act independently in building relationships, which I think rightly I shouldn't be present at. It's not for me to be part of that. So there's quite a bit of time on that. And then really for myself coming, it was about scene setting, actually, being honest about where I thought we were, so that the panel has an understanding of what operating baseline I think I'm pushing progress from, and then can judge me in that context of whether I've got it right or not. There was pretty robust challenge in the part of the meeting I was in, I have to say, both from union colleagues, searching questions from Martin. We've got colleagues from communities that have experienced our service for good and for less positive ways, who are in the room as well, and provided some challenge and thought. So my experience of it was a place not unlike this, where I get asked searching questions, I'm asked to bring evidence, and I think evidence is very important in this. It's no good just coming with words. I think you go back to the data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, in terms of outcomes. So it's our public polling. It's been able to dissect that public polling. It's been able to give specific examples of where we have done better getting into communities and where actually we're still struggling. I think the bridge between what happens inside and how we present ourselves and how we give our best value to communities is where I think the panel might be particularly useful, particularly if we see survivors of various tragedies brought into that space in greater number, who always speak with the greatest clarity about what we've done right and what we've done wrong. So I think there's not an aspect of culture that the panel won't be useful in challenging us about. And I look forward to it, because my whole experience of everything, from inspection to the scrutiny that's brought to bear in these panels, is it helps drive things forward. Ain't always comfortable. I don't always have the answers I want to give. But what it certainly does is ensure what we're doing is in plain sight without overstating where we're at, nor being so arrogant as to think it doesn't bear examination, challenge, review and change. And I do expect things to change as a result of whatever kind of challenge the panel brings alongside all the other forums we're both scrutinised and questioned in.
Thank you both. Back to you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Assembly Member Duvall.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to the panel, or is it good afternoon? Can we just go back about the advisory group and the makeup of the advisory group? It's a question to the Commissioner. The inspectorate sit on the advisory group. What's the thinking behind that? And how does that align with the role in managing the engage procedure with the LFB?
So we thought it was important, if as long as Martin was comfortable with it, to allow the HMI to have a seat on the panel so that they had direct view of the challenge that we were receiving in that space and would just lift that information directly into their own processes rather than, let's be frank, relying on us to translate it. You know, you're effectively cutting out the middle there, and we've got the national lead for fire. So the HMI, Roy Wiltshire, is sitting on the panel. So it's different from our named inspector, but Roy also sits on the enhanced monitoring process. So he can bring that information straight into that monitoring process. I think it's just another example of trying to be transparent. We've got nothing to hide in this. It's a difficult endeavour. There is more work to be done. I think we've made good progress with a lot of effort from good officers and good kind of team members in every part of the organisation. But I'm always the first to say there's more to do, and we just show ourselves transparently on view in that way. The more people look at it, the more leverage I've got to push change, because the challenge comes, and then it's my job to bring that back into the organisation and ensure people are listening.
Can I say from my point of view, I can envisage, I hope this reassures you, a situation where I might feel they're conflicted if a certain topic is under discussion, and I will not hesitate to ask them to recuse themselves and put that on the record. And as to why, I'm quite interested because I think London has a chance to be in the vanguard of change here, and obviously to have a national figure sitting next to me is very useful. And the thing about the inspectorate is obviously that they can bring to me what good process looks like nationwide. So they might say there's already a model being operated in Hertfordshire around recruitment, for instance. You might want to talk to them. You might want to include that. You know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel on everything. So when I was doing the Labour Party report, we had quite a lot to say about the use of social media by employees of the party, because there was no proper code of conduct, and whether they could bring the party in disrepute, you know, through homophobic or anti-Semitic remarks, matters of that sort. And I look very much at a police document around the use of social media and ACAS, because it seemed to me, let's see what's out there. I certainly wouldn't want any interaction with anybody who was involved in inspecting LFB, which is why I'm very happy to have the national figurehead. But Mr. Duval, I can assure you that if I felt there was something which they should not be listening to, I would ask them to leave.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member Duval. So I think one of the tests of any new sort of panel is level of quality of candidates. And we had a really strong field, but Martin impressed us with his experience, his reflection, and actually his passion for leading the panel as well. And as he's noted, he's got a reputation for independence in relation to some of his previous work, which was also attractive to us as well. In terms of the makeup of the panel, I was involved in discussions with the Fire Brigade on that, and it is right to have a discussion about, is it appropriate that sort of the regulator should be on the panel. From my perspective, we've actually got all the organisations, different people, but all the organisations involved in the engage process, so the Fire Performance Oversight Group. But we go further than that because we think it needs to sort of go beyond. It's not just about getting out of the engage process. It's about making sure that the Fire Brigade has the mechanisms and robust sort of assurance process themselves once the Fire Brigade, hopefully at some point in the future, near future, we hope, comes out of engage. So we do have the stakeholders who are involved in FPOG. But we've got the community involved. We've got internal and external stakeholders. So we've got trade unions, we've got the GLA, we've got people from who've experienced from New Crossfire, from the community panel and from the Grenfell community. We did actually discuss whether I should sit on it, but we felt that while the GLA could and should be represented, I already have a scrutiny role, and my role in relation to the advisory panel should be one of getting assurance, but also of having oversight in terms of how the LFB is using the recommendations from the panel. So I think a lot of thought has gone into the composition of the panel, and as Martin said, if he feels that somebody shouldn't be involved in the discussion, it's his prerogative as chair to have that discussion and for the person to recluse themselves. But I think that it's a really good opportunity to have those touch points that Assembly Member Kari mentioned earlier, in terms of making sure the voices in the process aren't just the voices of senior leadership within the Fire Brigade, but that we draw upon a huge range of external, internal people to make sure that those voices are heard and that we get that robust external challenge as well.
Okay, Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, if I can. First of all, just start by saying I do hope Martin doesn't have to stand outside fire stations around a brazier, but we'll see what the national employers offer us this year. One element of work I just want to bring into the discussion is the work of the Inclusive Fire Service Group, the IFSG, that for quite some years now has been designing strategies around cultures and behaviours. And I think it would be worthwhile the work Martin's doing at least considers some of that. One of the concerns, though, I think, around the inspectorate, and I caveat this by saying, whilst there wasn't an inspector, the Fire Brigade Union called for there to be one and campaigned repeatedly for there to be the reintroduction of the inspectorate. It's firmly our view that there has to be an inspectorate. We have serious concerns in and around the independence, though, of the inspectorate, its relationship directly to the Home Office, but also the leaders within the organisation of the inspectorate are, or certainly the number two, if you like, to the fire side of the inspectorate is a former chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council. And our criticisms have been throughout this discussion around culture, and actually predate your report here in the London Fire Brigade, is that the inspectorate haven't taken the section around people very seriously at all. Much of the reports that we've heard in London, much of the reports we've heard right across the UK Fire and Rescue Service that break in the news regularly now, and rightly so, have often been told to the inspectorate. They're not new stories. They've been around. We've heard them. Andy and I would have heard the stories within the LFB prior to them being reported on too. And the truth is that they have circled the wagons around chief fire officers and commissioners and not actually reported the detail of what they have found. And when they have, in some cases, reported that detail, they've significantly underplayed it. So our criticisms of the inspectorate are quite high and serious, and we remained committed to challenging them in relation to their inspections. But I think what was disappointing, and when I spoke of the IFSG, what that is I think probably the only sector-wide organisation where culture's ever been considered, and that includes the Fire Brigade Union, the National Fire Chiefs Council, the national employers and other trade unions that make up the sector. And that group, again, as I said, designed strategies for employers to begin to implement. And what we did is we reached out to the inspectorate a few years ago to ask them if they could build in those sector-wide recommendations into their inspection, and they haven't met with us. And we've reached out again following the kickstart of the IFSG, if you like, because of the issues the sector's facing. But yet we're still to find out if they're willing to accept those strategies. So I'm not convinced the inspectorate is taking culture seriously. I have found, and our view is that it, as I say, has circled its wagons around chief fire officers and commissioners and senior leaders, and has to do a lot better if it's going to hold services to account. So I would have some concerns and reservations about their involvement. I have not found them to be good players on this subject. But I think there are other national organisations that are, I think, taking it more seriously than the Inspectorate. And I think that probably does include the National Fire Chiefs Council. I've seen the work they're doing, and that is certainly better than what we've seen before. And I think, and I would say to Martin, and I'm sure he will, that working with the Fire Brigade Union, our democratic structures, would be important part of that work too, which I'm sure it is. Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to come back?
Would you mind, Chair, just on the subject of the Inspectorate? So I obviously shouldn't and can't speak to the National Union's relationship with the Inspectorate being appropriate, and Ben is entitled to express his view, particularly as a democratically elected kind of leader of that union. I can only speak to my own experience, which is that the Inspectorate has a very great interest in culture in London and has looked at it searchingly across 2 HMIs. And certainly from my position, doesn't particularly feel like they've circled the wagons round me, nor should they, because actually I should be held to the highest account, shouldn't I, if I want to undertake this role. So speaking in defence of the Inspectorate in London, I think they have applied themselves with some rigour. They're a very important part of the process. And if I think about my personal experiences from the Grenfell Tower fire and the great tragedy that represents in the context of failure of multiple institutions, actually, and I think Ben is with me on this from what he said, and the union, therefore, is actually the coming of the Inspectorate into the National Fire Service is probably the single most important thing that has happened since Grenfell, because the days of marking your own homework as a chief have passed, and that is a good thing. So yes, I'm sure there is a debate to be had about your relationship with colleagues in the Inspectorate and learning on both sides, I would suggest, but from my perspective, the Inspectorate, despite it being at times a challenging process, the one of inspection, difficult conversations, uncomfortable spaces, has been so important for the London Fire Brigade, and I both welcome it and see it as one of the most significant levers for change I've experienced.
The reason why the question's here is because of to explore the conflicts, and in terms of that, about an honesty and of approach, and I think people need to be able to say what they need to be able to say. But in terms of going forward on this journey, it's going to be a very interesting one and needs to be monitored, isn't it? It does need to be monitored. I'm a great believer in inspection service, but I'm also a great believer in self-improvement. If you don't change from within, it ain't going to happen. You can be inspected to death as much as you were. And to a degree, we've arrived really on the culture review, but also from not just those individual experiences, but about your organisation, but also about how we arrived at the engaged process, is about where probably a failure of one aspect of the Inspectorate service. If we were really honest, it might have brought us to a bit where we can move forward on. But, there's some real questioning that not just you have to answer or individuals have to answer about behaviours, but equally there's some external players, including this body went through it. My colleagues here before, and as a former member of the Fire Authority, about some of the information we received and didn't challenge appropriately. So I think,
I think they're really well-made points. And actually, again, I would like to say, because obviously running the largest service in the country, I do have a direct relationship both with Andy Cook and obviously Lee Freeman, who's our inspector. I know they're grappling with culture. They would be the first to acknowledge that the Inspectorate has got stuff to learn. So I've sat in meetings and heard that, and they've been clear. And indeed, in the FPOG process, with the Deputy Mayor sitting next to me, they did admit that they were looking to us in some ways for the measures that might come forward, because they saw what we'd brought into the sector with the independent review of culture as an opportunity to learn for them as well. So I do think there's probably more kind of openness there than's probably portrayed externally, but I think it's the right debate to have, and I absolutely agree with your point. You can inspect a service all you like, unless it is believed and held within the service and driven by the service, nothing will come of it. And that is actually our challenge. We called the independent review ourselves, so it didn't take the Inspectorate to come to that point. we called it on ourselves. And I know there will be London firefighters and officers listening. What I would say to them is I've stood in so many places and watched your unbelievable courage. You know, the apex example of that is Grenfell. But at the same time, alongside that, have stood institutional failings and poor behaviour when you got back to your fire stations. We cannot be the one service that is prepared to go into the tower if we are also not the service prepared to look ourselves in the eye, acknowledge those failings and sort it out ourselves. We're one of the great institutions of this country. If we claim to be that, we fix it ourselves. That is my view and will always be my view, and is where the relentless drive comes from to address this.
Can we just go back to trade union perspective? I know you can't speak for your colleagues in terms of that sit on the advisory panel. Do you think you are being sufficiently engaged with in terms of this process? It sounds like you are. And actually, you know, we ought to congratulate you in the trade union movement in terms of playing a part in this process, because what you said earlier on about juggling the issues of individual representation, particularly where they've fallen foul or behaved badly, to actually being a caller for change, is quite an important thing, that everybody is calling for that change. So congratulations to FBU for playing your part. But are you sufficiently engaged in terms of this process?
Yes, I think is the quick answer to it. What we have seen is a marked difference in the involvement, and again, I spoke of consultation, but the desire to have conversation about designing what could be prior to really getting to the consultation phase, we have seen a marked difference in the London Fire Brigade in terms of that. Of course, we would want more and more. You know, that's partly our role to keep trying to do that. And equally, we will never apologise where there is an absence of involving the voices of our sections. We won't apologise for robustly challenging that and insisting upon it. And really, the drive to your question is the drive why we felt we needed to create a campaign around Equality Matters. And it was really to identify in such a densely unionised workforce, where most are members of the Fire Brigade Union, that the victim, the perpetrator and the bystander in most instances will all be members of the Fire Brigade Union. And it's really important and crucial that we are able to speak to all three of those categories. And that is really why we have developed the campaign, why we are developing and working alongside the IFSG in developing strategies by which we can challenge all three, or support or challenge all three of those areas. So I am interested in how this work develops. I am interested in where we go next. It does feel to me like this is the opportunity to push forward real, serious, significant, deep-rooted change in the fire and rescue service. And if we don't take the opportunity now, when will we? I suppose is the concern. But we are committed to working alongside our colleagues here, and we will, again, we will do that in the fashion of being critical friends where necessary, but hopefully in terms of being able to design what this may look like going forward.
Okay, thank you. My last question.
Could I just say, from my perspective, very quickly, the input of both the trade union representatives on the first meeting of the panel was invaluable. My father was father of chapel in the NGA in the 50s and 60s, so I come from very much from kind of embedded trade union sort of background. This is not going to work unless the trade unions are with us, because ultimately the delivery to the grassroots, and possibly those uncomfortable conversations that might need to be had between a more senior or middle-ranking officer and a trade union rep, I think will be crucial to how any cultural review is ultimately judged. So I am very, very keen, I've just given Ben my email address, to work hand in hand with the unions. And I think actually it's a huge advantage that the brigade is so heavily unionised. Because if you have a way of getting to 97%, and I've already indicated that from a kind of comms perspective, I wouldn't mind doing a blog or a piece in Shout, or one of the things that the grassroots firefighters and administrative staff, read monthly, quarterly, or just introducing myself and explaining, what it is I hope to achieve, and also making it very clear that, I'm open to receive any complaints or concerns from anybody at any level, even those who may think it's a waste of time and it's gone too far. I'd still like to know why.
Well, thank you, Martin, for your approach, and I suspect around this table there's a lot of people that are wishing you well in the months to come in your tenure there. If I can just return to the Deputy Mayor and to the Fire Commissioner. A qualities culture meets improved service delivery and service delivery outcomes. So where are we on the final steps of getting out of Engage, which is just one story? I thought your comment was so apt when you said it's not just about getting out, it's a broader journey. And I say that, but it is a step along the way to move on from Engage to then to get back into this change that we require in the service.
So I don't mind who goes first, but I think if I could just say that I think the Commissioner's reflection on the relationship with the HMI, it has been a really positive conversation, and I've had conversations with the lead inspector for London and with Andy Cook, the chief HMI as well. And I think that there's a huge amount of respect for the London Fire Brigade and the work that's happening. Clearly, they know that we'd be very keen to come out of the Engage process, but they've got to feel comfortable that things have moved far enough in the right direction. They're not expecting everything to be perfect, and I'm sure neither is the Assembly in terms of next steps. But I think they do want confidence that the processes that have been put in place are robust, that they will deliver the change that is needed, not just to give them confidence, but we've heard a lot from Assembly members about how they have heard concerns from firefighters and other staff that they don't yet have confidence. They have confidence in Andy, and I think, but what they don't have necessarily is confidence that the change is embedded and lasting. So I think that the HMI needs to be able to get that confidence. They've referred to sort of the work around the professional standards unit, which is obviously first in the UK. So I think that is on course to be up and running in January, and I'm hopeful that with their support and the support of the other stakeholders around the table in those meetings, they will feel confident in the work that's already taken place and the sort of the ability of the London Fire Brigade to continue the journey, still with their support going forward, to sort of come out of that process. But it's not just about the Engage process, it is about making sure that there's lasting change.
So in terms of specifics, I think quite rightly, like this committee, particularly if we think about scrutiny in the past, the inspectorate want to see evidence. It's not about words, it's evidence. So they're coming back to the London Fire Brigade in late February to effectively conduct a re-inspection specifically on culture. They'll be sending in a team of between 10 and 15 inspectors, and over the course of a week they will visit everything from fire stations to internal teams. They will speak to every layer of the organisation, whether in closed watch visits, focus groups, or interviews with senior responsible members of staff, and that will follow a very significant formal request for data and evidence to demonstrate whether what we're saying is real from their perspective. That is an important benchmark, but I'm with the Deputy Mayor on this. It's an important benchmark because I want to be able to understand where perhaps from another perspective we're not meeting the challenge. I want to be able to reward staff who have done some very difficult things to shift the dial on this over the past year, but I don't see it as the end of anything. If anything, it's the beginning, because to emerge from that will allow us, I think, to reward good behaviour, but remind colleagues that was hard won and it is not done yet and it will not finish. And that perhaps actually does speak to the need to maintain scrutiny in all sorts of spaces, whether it's from the union, whether it's from my colleagues on the advisory panel, whether it's from here, whether it's in full inspection, which will roll out in June, where again they will address issues of culture. I welcome it all, because I have stood on the ground and saw how we let communities, and most importantly, rank and file firefighters down when that didn't exist, and where we were being able to tell ourselves how we thought we were doing, rather than getting all that challenge and advice and sight in. So I hope that gives you the confidence that for me it isn't about that totemic emergence from Engage. Yes, it's an important benchmark. Yes, there's a process, and I will bring the evidence and they will make their own determination. I make no statement on that. Let's see what they consider. But it is by no means done at that point.
Thank you.
Okay, Assemblymember Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. And I think I've said this before, but Commissioner, I think you really do set the right tone and use the right language. And I think you set that from the top. I often feel quite confident about the future of the culture of the London Fire Brigade. When I hear you speak about the changes that are necessary, I think you've got that right balance between commitment and determination, but also realism. I think we can't expect the change to happen overnight, because I think then you have a lot of surface level change and it's not deep rooted, and we need people's mindsets to change. And I think a lot of the work that was spoken about in terms of, from what we heard from Martin, about that kind of deeper community engagement work of having firefighters go out into communities and be present with people, so that they can sort of almost visualise themselves in that role in the future, is that deeper work that's required. So thank you for your comments today and your commitment on this. And equally, I wanted to just say, feeling very confident about your appointment, Martin, as chair of the advisory panel. I think your comments around independence are crucial in terms of embedding that in terms of process going forward for the institution, in terms of giving people that sense of safety when they want to go forward and bring forward a complaint or a grievance, and particularly your comments around relationship with trade unions. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think it's an absolute blessing that 97% of the institution is unionised, and that gives you a very direct way of communicating with members that I think will be crucial. On that point of the blog, I think it's a great idea. I would recommend a video, not a blog. I think more people are far more likely to engage with a little video clipped rather than reading a blog. But I think that's an excellent idea.
Giving you advice then,
exactly, yeah. Maybe you can film me on your iPhone or something.
Myself, I'd be more than happy to. I'll jump in as well. Okay, fantastic. I just wanted to really, because we're summing up really, I think most of the content has been covered today. It's just come to yourself, Deputy Mayor, around your role with the advisory panel. I know you've described it as getting assurance and overview rather than choosing to sit on it, which I think probably that sort of step back approach does help. So I was wondering if you could just speak to a little bit more about how you plan on monitoring the progress and the work of the advisory panel.
Well, I think there's two things, isn't there? There's sort of formal reporting and understanding sort of what they're discussing, and looking at the output from meetings. There's conversations with Martin as chair, and potentially I think I already engage with quite a lot of the other people on the panel. I'm sure they will tell me, particularly the FBU will tell me if there's a problem in terms of how the panel is working. But the ultimate test has to be whether they are being enabled to pick up on issues. So I think is the brigade being sort of full and frank? Does Martin as chair feel that they're getting all the information they need in a timely way? Are they getting reports of progress? Because as Martin himself said, this shouldn't be a talking shop. It has to be about progress and about the people giving up their time, including Martin, to give something back. They need to see that there's real progress, that they can define where they've made a difference in their intervention. And I can tell you just from the conversation I had with Martin that I then did speak to the Commission about afterwards, there's points of engagement they can have with the processes. So in the redevelopment of the firefighter trainee course that's sort of happening at the moment, what advice do they give? How does it get taken up? And my role is partly to triangulate that, to make sure that I can identify points of reference that have changed, and that the people on the panel can also see that their work is making a difference, but that firefighters and other staff can see that there's real change. Because I think you can have a lot of talk without action, and it's about how you manage to have appropriate action in a timely way. And I think a big part of my role, not just in relation to the advisory panel, but in relation to the culture change within the fire service, is about challenge, is about sort of asking the questions at the right point, coming back to ask those questions again, because obviously the Fire Brigade is also a very busy service that's under pressure to serve London. So coming back and sort of having those conversations, both in public and behind closed doors with the Commissioner through my board. The Mayor obviously takes a very direct interest in culture. One of his key things is about diversity within public services, particularly those that he has within the GLA family. So I think every single conversation I have with the Commissioner and with other people within the fire service comes back to culture. So I can walk from the front door of Union Street up to the 3rd floor and have 4 different conversations. I can go to a fire station, I can go to an event, and like Assembly members, I get information back. So I think, but ultimately, I would want to understand from Martin how he feels that the advisory panel is making a difference. And if they don't feel that they're getting the resource or the commitment they need or the support they need from the fire service, or the fire service isn't listening, to take that up on their behalf. But I actually think Martin's quite capable of making his voice heard himself, and that's one of the reasons we were very happy, and it was a unanimous decision to appoint him. I think you'll make a big difference, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Before I bring Martin in, Commissioner, it looks like you want to come in.
Yeah, it was just really to come back to your point about community engagement and speak to a very important point that Martin made, actually. You know, school fates are important, actually, education, young people, so they are important, and they're important markers within communities, because actually your access into communities is very often through schools, but you've got to follow up on it. And actually, I think one of the biggest things we will do as part of this is not the more obvious stuff around misconduct, nor actually the big internal education programmes, is following up on our promise that we made post-Grenfell and we're beginning to deliver now in borough risk management plans and station plans to get into all the communities. And I can give you some singular examples. So if I think about East London, if I think about some of my East London stations in Tower Hamlets and Newham, I've got a lot of white, older firefighters there, people I join with, people I know really well. Genuinely, their instinct at one time would not necessarily have been aware of, nor all the cultural intricacies of the area they serve. But because we've had a big push to get people out into different parts of East London, you know, they've turned out to be brilliant at it. We shouldn't assume that our staff don't have the instinct to do this really well, because my experience of them is they're often people who have so much in common with the communities they serve, even if their background is different in terms of where they started in life, but we have to get them out there. There has not always been an instinct in the London Fire Brigade to do that, because our response is so central to what we do. You know, we've got the best attendance times in the world. I think sometimes we kind of held ourselves to that standard, which is equally important, by the way, because that's what people really want us for, but we didn't always challenge ourselves about the spaces we went into. My experience as we do that increasingly, and Donna Peters absolutely deserves some credit for this, she is a force of nature, that is an excellent hire by us. We're getting out into some of those spaces. Some of those conversations are uncomfortable, by the way. There is challenge within them, but my experience of it, where I've gone back to firefighters, is once they've overcome that barrier of discomfort, experience of difference, is they bring something back into their day-to-day working life and how they work with their colleagues. So actually, I think it's one of the most important things we're doing, and we should bring evidence to this committee and other places of scrutiny about how that is or isn't working. So I would expect to be challenged on it, I would expect to be asked about it, and I would expect to bring some demonstration of where we've gone, and actually that we've gone and asked those communities whether they actually did get what they wanted, how they experienced their interaction with firefighters, as much as the internal ask. But it's a very important piece that I perhaps hadn't touched on enough.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we'd really value having that information brought to the committee in the future.
I was also going to say that it's a great way of breaking barriers as well. So I've certainly walked past a fire station in East London where the Sikh community were bringing samosas in for the firefighters, and it was just lovely to see the the interaction that was going on. So those are very good ways of breaking down barriers and mutual suspicion, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's essential long-term work. Martin, I wondered if you wanted to speak at all to whether you feel satisfied with the relationship between the way that Deputy Mayor is planning on having that sort of feedback loop in terms of monitoring the progress of the advisory panel, both in terms of the formal but the informal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Baroness is a kind of conduit for two-way communication, possibly three, so she could bring issues from you. So if after this there are people, I mean, I've heard about a letter that I've not seen, for instance, that she can get to me by email or scanning. It may be there are times that we're having a conversation and Andy isn't in the loop because we think politically it's embarrassing for him, perhaps. But no, I'm very happy. We had a very fruitful conversation, Zoom conversation, in the middle of last week, before this meeting. I should also place on record my thanks to Philippa for supplying me with all the paperwork, which I have on my phone. And so I think it's working well. I do. I think everybody's been very open, very transparent. People, I don't think we're tugging in different directions. I think those relationships are building. And I'm very keen for people to feel that they can contact me in confidence, if need be, to raise concerns. I'll then have to try and process who I express those concerns to and how, whether I want to make people aware of the source of the complaint or whether I say this is something I'm aware. I mean, with the Labour Party report, I had so many emails into my inbox about things that they didn't feel confident going through the formal inquiry process because they thought the party might have access to their data. So they emailed my emails in the public domain for work. They emailed me directly, and I find that quite a useful way of finding out what's really happening on the ground.
Thank you, Martin. I think that accessibility is going to be crucial going forward, and I echo Assemblymember Duval's points around wishing you the best of luck for your future investigations.
Thank you for that. And just to add on those visits, how important they've been, and I know that the Vaswani Centre in Cricklewood, where I live, had the first time the LFB attended was 3 years ago, and in that time they've become, you've got young adults, all sorts of people on the fire trucks. Final question, Assemblymember Polansky.
Thank you, Chair. Martin, just to clarify something, because I agree with 99.9% of what you said, which is good. Right. But earlier on, I feel like you said that there's no suggestion that this isn't actually affecting the firefighting duties. But my understanding from hearing testimony and speaking to people is if you feel someone's racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic, transphobic, whatever it might be, you feel like they've not got your back. So then if you're running into a highly dangerous situation, then how can that not affect?
No, I can understand from the firefighter's perspective. I probably misspoke. I meant I hadn't seen evidence that any attitudinal issue had caused a worse outcome for a victim of fire, which I thought was really quite important. So it's actually the obverse of the problems we have with the Met Police, for instance, where operationally race and gender is widely thought to make a difference to outcome. Who's charged with what, who's cautioned, who's arrested, etc. I haven't had any experience of anybody saying, I think my house was allowed to burn for longer, or my toaster fire wasn't dealt with because I'm an ethnic minority. But you're absolutely right. As I said earlier, people need to feel safe in their working environment if you want them to perform well. And it seems to me, as I said, if they're getting sleepless nights or dreading going to work, as some people have expressed to me already, then that's not going to make for an efficient, well-run service.
That makes sense. Thanks
so
for clarification.
Hopefully we're up to 100% now.
And the final question is, what is your view of the progress and pace of cultural change in the Fire Brigade?
I think that in most institutions it's pretty glacial, but I'd like to think that what I will bring to the party is something whereby I can say that these are targets. You need to resurvey, and you need to find out whether people do feel there's been material change, and if not, why not? And we may need to think about doing that. I know Andy's talked about survey fatigue. I mean, initial 10 years a year. We may need to think about certainly doing it before the end of that year, and say, we've been in post for 6-8 months. Yeah. How do you feel it's going? And that's something I want to kind of have a continuous dialogue with people that I meet, because I am intending to try and get to a good few stations and community groups and say, or what can we do to make things better, to make you feel more comfortable, to make you feel more valued? Because I think ultimately that's what it's about. It's how valued do you feel in your working environment? And I think it's absolutely vital that people feel valued. And these are very close relationships, these watches. You know, you might have 6 or 8 of you, and as you said, you've got to have each other's back, you've got to have confidence in each other, you've got to think that you're being treated fairly. But again, the downside of that is you're very, very identifiable as a complainant. Because you were the person who was on the hose when you were shouted at. Because there could only have been one other person, and the other person was the person who shouted at you. How do you complain about that person? How do you complain about that person if your line manager has been a firefighter with your protagonist for 15 years and you've been there for 6 months? So there are all these difficult structural issues, but I think that may be something that the unions can help us with, because there is obviously an issue around power dynamic as well, it seems to me.
Thanks. It's really good to hear how much the trade union is going to be embedded in this process. So thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. I just thank all of my fellow Assembly members and our guests for your contributions today. I realise this is a tricky subject and we really covered a lot of ground in that time. We have a few short items of business before we conclude. You're very welcome to stay for the few minutes or make your way out. It's up to you. Can we note the report and today's discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion?
Agreed.
And can the committee note its work programme for the 2023-24 and additional activity undertaken since our last meeting?
Noted.
And that also includes the informal meeting with the London Fire Brigade Women's Networks. Yes, okay. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, 31st of January 2024 in this chamber at City Hall. I have no other urgent business, so I now declare this meeting to be closed.
Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.